The autumn wind whistled through the ancient corridors of Hogwarts' School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, carrying with it the familiar scent of aged stone and magical possibility. Evelina Hawthorne's footsteps echoed against the flagstone floor as she made her way to the designated meeting spot where young Barnaby Twiddleton awaited her tutoring session. "Evelina, over here." Barnaby's eager voice carried from around the corner, followed by a resounding crash and the distinct sound of armor pieces clattering across the floor. Oh no, not again. Rounding the corner, Evelina couldn't suppress her smile at the sight of the first-year Hufflepuff tangled in what remained of a suit of armor. "Barnaby, what did we say about practicing spells without supervision?" "I just wanted to impress you with the levitation charm we learned today," he mumbled, his face flushed with embarrassment. "But the armor was heavier than I expected, and well," he gestured helplessly at the mess around him. As Evelina helped Barnaby to his feet, she noticed something peculiar. The air around them seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer-warmed cobblestones. But this was different. There was a distinct magical signature to it, one she'd never encountered before. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her hand instinctively tightening around her wand. Barnaby looked up from dusting off his robes. "Feel what? Is it another ghost? Please don't let it be Peeves." But before Evelina could respond, a whisper echoed through the corridor, not from any particular direction, but seemingly from the very stones themselves. The words were indistinct, yet they carried a weight that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Their tutorial session forgotten, Evelina began investigating the phenomenon, with Barnaby trailing nervously behind her. As they moved deeper into the castle, the whispers grew more frequent, and the magical disturbances more pronounced. "Perhaps we should tell Professor Moonshadow," Barnaby suggested, his voice quavering slightly. "Not yet," Evelina replied, her curiosity piqued. "Let's try to understand what we're dealing with first." Their investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Milo Fenwick, his Ravenclaw scarf slightly askew as he hurried toward them. "Evelina, I've been looking everywhere for you." The strangest thing just happened in the library. All the books in the divination section started floating and arranging themselves in peculiar patterns. Before Evelina could respond, a familiar drawling voice cut through their conversation. Well, if it isn't the amateur detective squad." Sapphire Blakely emerged from the shadows, her Slytherin robes flowing dramatically behind her. "I suppose you've noticed the disturbances too." The tension between Evelina and Sapphire was palpable, their complicated history hanging in the air like an unspoken spell. But before either could speak, the magical shimmer intensified, and the whispers grew louder. "It's getting stronger," Milo observed, pulling out a small notebook covered in mysterious symbols. "These patterns, they're similar to something I saw in my divination studies, but they're not quite the same." As the four students stood in the corridor, debating their next move, Professor Thaddeus Plum appeared, seemingly materializing from nowhere. His usual eccentric demeanor was replaced by an uncharacteristic seriousness. "The walls have many secrets," he said cryptically, running his hand along the stone. "But not all of them are meant to be heard. Tell me, Miss Hawthorne, what do you know about the concept of magical resonance?" Before Evelina could answer, a new figure joined their growing group, Malachi Wraithstone, the mysterious transfer student. His dark eyes seemed to absorb the magical disturbances around them, and for a moment, Evelina could have sworn she saw recognition flash across his face. "The whispers," he said softly, "they're not random. They're trying to tell us something." The magical energy in the corridor suddenly spiked, causing the torches to flicker wildly. The whispers grew more urgent, and in the chaos, Evelina caught a few distinct words. Danger, coming, prepare. Professor Plum's expression grew grave. It seems the castle itself is trying to warn us. But of what, I wonder? As the group stood in the increasingly unstable magical environment, Evelina's mind raced with questions. What was causing these disturbances? Why now? And why did Malachi seem to understand them so well? The mystery of the Whispering Halls had only begun to unfold, and Evelina had a feeling that solving it would require more than just her talent for potions. As she looked at the diverse group gathered around her, the clumsy but earnest Barnaby, the brilliant Milo, the enigmatic Sapphire, and the mysterious Malachi, she realized that each of them might hold a piece of this magical puzzle. But one question burned brighter than the rest. What kind of danger was Hogwarts trying to warn them about? And would they be able to face it when it arrived? The whispers continued their urgent murmur, leaving the students and professors to wonder. What secrets did these ancient walls hold, and at what cost would they be revealed? The morning sun cast dappled shadows through the greenhouse glass as Evelina Hawthorne hurried to her herbology class, her mind still preoccupied with the peculiar magical disturbances she'd witnessed in the corridors. As she pushed open the heavy glass door, the usual earthy scent of soil and magical flora was tinged with something different, something sweeter, almost intoxicating. Late again, Miss Hawthorne. Professor Plum's eyes twinkled with their usual mixture of amusement and mystery. Though perhaps timing is relative when dealing with the Tempest Bloom. The class gathered around a shimmering, opalescent plant that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Its petals appeared to be moving in slow motion, opening and closing like a dreaming eye. Milo Fenwick, already taking detailed notes, shifted to make room for Evelina at their shared workbench. "Did you feel that strange energy in the corridors again?" he whispered, but before Evelina could respond, she noticed something odd. Sapphire Blakely, usually sharp and attentive, was staring vacantly at the Tempest Bloom, her usually precise wand work completely forgotten. Professor Plum continued his lecture, his voice taking on an unusually serious tone. The Tempest Bloom is a remarkable specimen, one that exists simultaneously in multiple moments of time. But remember, students, memory and time are delicate threads in the tapestry of magic. Handle them with care. As the class progressed, strange things began to happen. Barnaby Twiddleton, attempting to prune a nearby whistling willow, suddenly stopped mid-snip and asked, "Professor, wasn't it snowing yesterday?" It was, in fact, a warm September morning. Evelina exchanged worried glances with Milo. Something wasn't right. More students began showing signs of confusion. Some forgot what class they were in. Others couldn't remember what they'd had for breakfast. Even more disturbing, Sapphire Blakely began speaking about events that hadn't happened yet. "Watch out for the falling chandelier in the Great Hall tomorrow," she said dreamily to no one in particular. "The ghost of Sir Nicholas gets quite upset about it." Professor Plum seemed unusually calm about the situation, almost as if he'd expected it. But there was something in his eyes. Was it worry or guilt? The mysterious new student, Malachi Wraithstone, stood apart from the chaos, his dark eyes fixed not on the Tempest Bloom, but on Professor Plum. He appeared to be the only student completely unaffected by the strange phenomena. When Professor Moonshadow burst into the greenhouse, her usually perfectly arranged robes slightly askew, the tension in the air became palpable. "Thaddeus," she said sharply, "we need to talk. Now." But before Professor Plum could respond, Evelina noticed something alarming. The Tempest Bloom's pulsing light was growing stronger, and with each pulse, more students seemed to lose their grip on the present moment. Some were reliving past classes, Others were having conversations with people who weren't there, and a few appeared to be experiencing moments that hadn't happened yet. "Professor," Evelina called out, her voice steady despite her growing concern. "I think the plant is affecting more than just our memories. It's affecting our perception of time itself." Professor Plum and Professor Moonshadow exchanged a loaded look that spoke volumes. "Miss Hawthorne," Professor Plum said slowly, "what makes you say that?" But before Evelina could explain her theory, Milo grabbed her arm. "Look," he whispered urgently, pointing to Malachi. The brooding student had pulled out his wand and was muttering something under his breath, his eyes fixed on the tempest bloom. The plant's glow intensified, and suddenly the greenhouse seemed to exist in multiple moments at once. Through the glass walls, Evelina could see both daylight and starlight, summer flowers and winter frost, all overlapping like double-exposed photographs. Professor Moonshadow raised her wand, but Professor Plum stopped her. "Wait," he said, his voice heavy with an emotion Evelina couldn't quite identify. "There's something you all need to know about this plant, and about why it's here." The greenhouse had become a temporal chaos, with students caught in different time streams, but Evelina noticed that she, Milo, Malachi, and the professors remained anchored in the present. Was it coincidence, or was there something more to their immunity? As Professor Plum began to explain, Evelina couldn't shake the feeling that the tempest bloom's appearance was somehow connected to the magical disturbances she'd witnessed in the corridors. But what was the connection? And why did Malachi seem to know more than he was letting on? The answers would have to wait, as Professor Plum's next words sent a chill down everyone's spine. The tempest bloom isn't just affecting memories, it's trying to warn us. Something is coming to Hogwarts, something that shouldn't be here, something that exists outside of time itself. What could be so dangerous that it would cause a magical plant to disrupt the very fabric of time? And why did Professor Plum seem to know more about it than he was willing to share? As Evelina looked around at her affected classmates, she realized that unraveling this mystery might be more dangerous than any of them could imagine. But one question burned brighter than all the others in her mind. Was Professor Plum trying to protect them from something? Or was he hiding something that could put them all in danger? The morning sun cast long shadows through the towering windows of Hogwarts Library as Milo Fenwick hunched over a weathered tome, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns on its ancient pages. The events of the past few weeks, the strange memory lapses affecting students after their exposure to Professor Plum's mysterious plant, had led him down a rabbit hole of research that seemed to grow deeper with each passing day. "Milo, you've been here since dawn." Evelina's voice broke through his concentration as she settled into the chair beside him. "Have you found anything?" Milo looked up, dark circles under his eyes betraying his lack of sleep. "Something's not right, Evelina. These patterns." He pushed the book toward her, revealing elaborate circular designs that seemed to shift and change as they watched. They're exactly like the ones we saw forming in the frost on the greenhouse windows after the memory incidents. "But what does it mean?" Evelina leaned closer, her brow furrowed in concentration. Before Milo could respond, Sapphire Blakely emerged from between the towering bookshelves, her presence commanding attention as always. Well, if it isn't the two brightest minds in Hogwarts, burning the midnight oil." Her tone carried its usual hint of mockery, but there was something else there. Concern, perhaps. "Sapphire," Milo acknowledged quietly, "have you noticed anything strange in the Slytherin common room lately?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "The patterns," he explained, pointing to the book. "They're appearing everywhere now. I've seen them in the Ravenclaw Tower, etched into the stone like they've always been there. but I know they haven't." Just then, young Barnaby Tweedleton stumbled into their conversation, quite literally, knocking over a stack of books in the process. Sorry," he whispered loudly, earning a stern look from Madame Pince. "But you all need to see this." The group followed Barnaby to a seemingly ordinary corridor wall where, to their amazement, the same intricate patterns were slowly materializing in the stone. But there was something different about these. They formed words. "Seek the truth where wisdom dwells, in chambers deep where silence tells." Milo read aloud. "What was forgotten shall be found, when past and present come unbound." "A riddle?" Evelina breathed. "But what does it mean?" As they pondered the mysterious words, Malachi Wraithstone appeared silently behind them, his dark eyes fixed on the wall. "It's a warning," he said softly, causing them all to jump. "These patterns, they're not just decorative, they're an ancient form of magical communication." Sapphire's hand instinctively moved toward her wand. "And how exactly would you know that, Wraithstone?" Before he could answer, Professor Moonshadow's voice echoed through the corridor. "What are you all doing here?" Her stern gaze swept over the group, lingering on the wall where the patterns had already begun to fade. "Professor," Milo stepped forward, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I believe these patterns are connected to what happened in Professor Plum's greenhouse. They're appearing all over the castle, and they seem to be trying to tell us something." Professor Moonshadow's expression shifted slightly. "Mr. Fenwick, sometimes the answers we seek are hidden in plain sight. But be careful, not all riddles are meant to be solved." With that cryptic warning, she turned and strode away, her robes billowing behind her. As the group dispersed, Milo couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something significant. The patterns, the riddle, Professor Plum's plant, the memory losses. They were all connected, but how? Later that evening, as Milo sat in the Ravenclaw common room, he noticed something peculiar about the ceiling's star chart. The stars seemed to be arranging themselves into familiar patterns, the same ones from the wall, the book, and the greenhouse. "What are you trying to tell us?" he whispered to the empty room. Suddenly, a piece of parchment slipped from between the pages of his book, containing a message in Professor Plum's distinctive handwriting. "Meet me in the greenhouse at midnight. Bring only those you trust completely. The truth cannot wait any longer." As Milo stared at the note, one question burned in his mind. Who could he truly trust when memories themselves couldn't be relied upon? The clock began to strike 11, and Milo knew he had a decision to make. Should he share this with Evelina and the others? Could he trust Sapphire, despite her Slytherin allegiances? What about the mysterious Malachi, who seemed to know more than he was letting on? The patterns on the ceiling continued their hypnotic dance, as if mocking him with their secrets. Whatever was happening at Hogwarts, Milo had a feeling that tonight would change everything. But would it be for better or worse? The autumn wind whistled through the corridors of Hogwarts as Evelina Hawthorne found herself unable to shake off the nagging feeling that something was terribly amiss. The puzzle Milo had discovered in the previous week had left them with more questions than answers, but it was Sapphire Blakely's recent behaviour that truly set Evelina's mind racing. "Have you noticed anything strange about Sapphire lately?" Evelina whispered to Milo during their shared potions class. The cauldrons bubbled around them, creating a perfect cover for their conversation. Milo glanced nervously at his friend while stirring his potion counterclockwise. "You mean besides the fact that she's been sneaking out of the castle every night this week? I thought I was the only one who noticed." But it wasn't just the nighttime wanderings that concerned Evelina. Ever since Malachi Wraithstone had arrived at Hogwarts, Sapphire had changed. The once outspoken and confident Slytherin now seemed withdrawn, her usual sharp wit replaced by distant stares and hushed conversations in dark corners. I saw them together in the library yesterday, piped up Barnaby Twiddleton, who had been eavesdropping from the next table. His attempt to join the conversation caused him to knock over his vial of salamander blood, earning a stern look from the professor. Evelina helped clean up Barnaby's mess, while continuing their discussion in hushed tones. What were they doing? They were looking at some really old books in the restricted section. Professor Moonshadow had given them special permission, but Barnaby hesitated, his round face scrunching up with worry. The books looked scary. They had these weird symbols on them, like the ones we found in Milo's puzzle. The mention of the puzzle made Evelina's heart skip a beat. Could there be a connection? What if Sapphire and Malachay's research wasn't just innocent curiosity? Later that day, during her biology class, Evelina couldn't focus on Professor Plum's lecture about whispering willows. Her mind kept wandering to Sapphire, who was working with Malachay at the far end of the greenhouse. They seemed to be having an intense discussion while pruning their plant. Professor Plum must have noticed her distraction because he approached her workstation with a knowing look in his eyes. Sometimes, Miss Hawthorne, the shadows we chase are merely reflections of our own fears. But other times, he paused, adjusting his dirt-covered spectacles. There are warnings we would do well to heed. That evening, Evelina decided to confide in Professor Moonshadow about her concerns. But as she approached the Transfiguration classroom, she overheard voices from within. "The signs are becoming clear, Celeste." Professor Plum's voice carried through the door. "The forest is restless, and the creatures speak of a darkness stirring." "Thaddeus, we can't jump to conclusions," Professor Moonshadow replied firmly. "Just because Mr. Wraithstone comes from a complicated background doesn't mean—" "It's not just about the boy," Plum interrupted. "It's about what he might have brought with him. The ancient magic is awakening, and Miss Blakely might be more involved than we realize." Evelina's heart pounded in her chest. What ancient magic were they talking about? And how was Sapphire involved? Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle tap on her shoulder. She spun around to find Milo, his face pale in the dim corridor light. "Evelina, you need to see this," he whispered, holding up a piece of parchment covered in familiar symbols, the same ones from his puzzle. "Where did you get that?" she asked, studying the intricate patterns. "It fell out of Sapphire's bag during defense against the dark arts. But look at this part." He pointed to a specific section. I've translated some of it. It mentions something called the Shadowbane Ritual and the next full moon. The full moon was just 3 days away. As if on cue, a shadow passed by the window. Too large to be a bird, too swift to be a broom. When they rushed to look outside, they caught a glimpse of 2 figures heading toward the forbidden forest. One with Sapphire's distinctive silver-streaked hair, the other unmistakably Malachay's tall, dark form. "We have to follow them," Evelina declared, already moving toward the stairs. "Wait." Milo grabbed her arm. "Remember what happened last time we went into the forest after dark? We should tell Professor Moonshadow." But Evelina shook her head. "By the time we convince any of the professors, it might be too late. Besides, Sapphire may be breaking rules, but she's still our friend. What if she's in trouble? Or what if she's causing trouble?" A small voice added. They turned to find Barnaby standing nearby, clutching his wand nervously. "Either way," Evelina said, "we need to find out what's happening. Are you with me?" Milo sighed, knowing there was no talking her out of it. "Always. But we should at least leave a note for Professor Plum." He seems to know more about what's going on than he's letting on. As they hastily scribbled a message and prepared to venture into the darkness, Evelina couldn't help but wonder, was Sapphire a victim or a conspirator? What secrets did Malachi bring to Hogwarts? And most importantly, what ancient magic were they about to encounter in the depths of the Forbidden Forest? The answers awaited them in the gathering darkness, but would they be ready for what they discovered? The autumn wind whispered through the corridors of Hogwarts as Evelina hurried down the dimly lit hallway, her footsteps echoing against the ancient stone walls. She had just witnessed something peculiar. Professor Moonshadow storming out of Professor Plum's greenhouse, her usually composed demeanour shattered by what appeared to be barely contained fury. "Did you see that?" Milo whispered, catching up to Evelina. His face was flushed from running, his Ravenclaw scarf slightly askew. "I've never seen Professor Moonshadow so undone." Evelina nodded, her mind still racing from her recent discoveries about Sapphire and Malachi. Something's not right, Milo. First Sapphire's strange behaviour, now this. It can't be a coincidence. As they rounded the corner, they nearly collided with Barnaby, who was attempting to practice a levitation charm on his pet toad. "Egelina," he exclaimed, dropping his wand in excitement. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Professor Plum was muttering something about Moon's shadow and ancient promises while packing up his herbs earlier. The three students exchanged meaningful glances. Could there be a connection between Professor Moonshadow's title and Professor Plum's cryptic words? Meanwhile, in the castle's eastern tower, Professor Celeste Moonshadow paced her office, her normally pristine robes slightly dishevelled. "After all these years, Thaddeus," she muttered to herself, "you still refuse to see reason." The tension between the two professors had been building for weeks, ever since Malachi Wraithstone's arrival at Hogwarts. But why? What did they know about the mysterious new student that others didn't? As night fell, Evelina and Milo found themselves drawn to the courtyard by the sound of raised voices. They hid behind a stone pillar, watching as Professor Moonshadow confronted Professor Plum beneath the rising full moon. "You can't protect them forever, Thaddeus," Professor Moonshadow's voice carried across the courtyard. "The ancient magic is stirring, and your greenhouse secrets won't stay buried much longer." Professor Plum's usually gentle face hardened. "Some secrets are better left in the shadows, Celeste. You of all people should understand that." What happened next would be whispered about in the Hogwarts corridors for weeks to come. Professor Moonshadow raised her wand, her silver robes billowing in the magical wind that suddenly swept through the courtyard. Professor Plum responded in kind, but his stance was defensive rather than aggressive. Revelio Veritas. Professor Moonshadow's spell shot through the air like liquid moonlight. Professor Plum deflected it with a complex wave of his wand, causing the spell to scatter into countless sparkles. "You're letting fear cloud your judgment, old friend." Their duel intensified, but it was unlike any magical combat Evelina had ever witnessed. Each spell seemed to carry hidden meaning, each defensive move laden with years of shared history. The air crackled with not just magic, but with unspoken words and long-held secrets. Unknown to the dueling professors, Sapphire Blakely watched from the shadows of the astronomy tower, her face unreadable. Beside her, Malachi stood perfectly still, his dark eyes reflecting the magical display below. "Should we stop them?" Milo whispered to Evelina, his voice trembling with concern. Before Evelina could respond, a particular spell collision caused an unexpected reaction. A burst of golden light erupted between the two professors, forming what appeared to be a magical contract in the air, ancient runes glowing with an otherworldly light. Professor Moonshadow gasped, her wand arm lowering slightly. "The oath of the guardians," she breathed. "You didn't break it after all." Professor Plum's face softened. "I've kept every promise I made that night, Celeste, including the one about protecting the children." The magical contract faded, leaving the courtyard in darkness once more. The two professors stood in silence, years of misunderstanding seemingly dissolved in that single moment of revelation. But what was this oath of the guardians? And how did it connect to the strange events unfolding at Hogwarts? Evelina's mind raced with questions as she observed the aftermath of the duel. From her hiding place, she noticed something curious. A small luminous flower had bloomed where the magical contract had appeared. Professor Plum picked it carefully, offering it to Professor Moonshadow like a peace offering. "Perhaps," Professor Moonshadow said, accepting the flower, "it's time we told them the truth about the Wraithstone legacy." The mention of Malach's surname made Evelina's heart skip a beat. She glanced up at the astronomy tower, but Sapphire and Malachi had vanished as silently as they had appeared. As the professors departed, their shadows merging in the moonlight, Evelina couldn't shake the feeling that this duel had been more than just a confrontation between old rivals. It was the beginning of something much larger, something that would change everything they thought they knew about magic, loyalty, and the true purpose of their beloved school. What secrets lay hidden in Professor Plum's greenhouse? What was the oath of the guardians? And most importantly, what did it all have to do with Malachi Wraithstone? The answers seemed to be drawing nearer, but with each revelation, new questions arose, weaving an ever more intricate web of mystery around the halls of Hogwarts. The morning sun streamed through the dungeon windows of the potions classroom, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Evelina Hawthorne couldn't help but smile as she watched Barnaby Tweedleton carefully counting salamander scales at their shared workbench. The young Hufflepuff's tongue stuck out slightly in concentration, his round face scrunched in determination. 7, 8, 9. Barnaby muttered, his hands trembling slightly as he handled each delicate scale. "Evelina, are you sure it's 10 scales?" "The book looks like it says 16, but the ink's all smudged." "It's definitely 10, Evelina assured him, stirring her own cauldron of illumination potion. "Remember what happened last time you added too many ingredients?" Poor Professor Slughorn's eyebrows took a week to grow back. The memory made Barnaby flush crimson. "I just want to get it right this time. Everyone else makes it look so easy." He glanced enviously at Milo Fenwick's perfectly simmering potion, which was already emanating a soft golden glow. From across the room, Sapphire Blakely's voice carried with its usual hint of mockery. "Oh, look everyone, Twiddleton's actually counting. Should we alert the Daily Prophet?" A few Slytherins snickered, but their laughter was cut short by a sharp look from Malachi Wraithstone, who sat alone in the corner, his potion an unusual shade of midnight blue. Evelina was about to defend Barnaby when the young Hufflepuff accidentally knocked his entire jar of moonstone powder into his cauldron. Time seemed to slow as the pearlescent powder descended into the bubbling liquid. "No, Barnaby, wait." Evelina reached out, but it was too late. The reaction was instantaneous and unlike anything they'd ever seen. Instead of the expected explosion, Barnaby's potion began to emit a haunting melody, like distant wind chimes in a storm. The liquid rose from the cauldron in spiraling tendrils, forming shapes in the air. Dragons, unicorns, phoenixes, all crafted from the glowing substance. Students gasped and backed away, but Malachi Wraithstone suddenly stood, his dark eyes fixed on the ethereal display. "That's impossible," he whispered, though in the stunned silence, everyone heard him. Professor Moonshadow burst through the door, likely drawn by the commotion, with Professor Plum close behind her. Their recent duel seemed forgotten in the face of this unprecedented phenomenon. Everyone out. Professor Moonshadow commanded, but then froze as one of the liquid shapes formed into a perfect replica of an ancient rune, one that made Professor Plum inhale sharply. "Thaddeus," Professor Moonshadow said quietly, "isn't that the symbol from Muir?" "Indeed it is, Celeste." Professor Plum interrupted, his usual whimsy replaced by grave seriousness. "Mr. Twiddleton, my boy, what exactly did you add to your potion?" Barnaby, pale and shaking, could barely speak. "Just what was in the recipe, Professor. And then the moonstone powder. All of it. I'm so sorry." But Professor Plum wasn't listening anymore. He was exchanging meaningful looks with Professor Moonshadow, their recent animosity apparently forgotten in light of this development. Milo Fenwick, who had been scribbling frantically in his notebook, suddenly spoke up. "The musical notes, they're not random. They're forming a pattern." His voice trembled with excitement. "It's similar to the prophecy we studied in divination last week." Sapphire Blakely had moved closer to Malachi, who was still staring at the floating symbols with an unreadable expression. "You know something about this, don't you?" she whispered to him. Malachi's only response was a slight tightening of his jaw. Evelina's mind was racing. How could a simple mistake create such complex magic? And why did it seem to affect everyone so differently? She noticed that each floating shape seemed to react to individual students' presence, changing color and form as it passed near them. "Professor Plum," she called out, "the shapes, they're responding to our magical signatures, aren't they?" Before he could answer, the liquid shapes began to coalesce into a single brilliant form, a map of Hogwarts, but one that showed passages and rooms that couldn't possibly exist. Or could they? "Well," Professor Plum said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of riddle speak, "it seems Mr. Twiddleton's blunder has revealed something that's been hiding in plain sight all along. The question is, are we ready for what it's showing us?" The map pulsed once, twice, and then dissolved into a shower of golden sparks that settled gently on the stunned students below. As the last spark faded, an uncomfortable silence fell over the classroom. Everyone was looking at Barnaby, who seemed torn between pride and terror at what he'd accidentally unleashed. "I think," Professor Moonshadow said carefully, "we need to have a serious discussion about this in the headmaster's office." She paused, looking at each student in turn. "All of you." As they filed out of the classroom, Evelina couldn't help but notice how Malachi lingered behind, his hand tracing the air where the map had been. What did he know? And more importantly, what had Barnaby's accident really revealed about Hogwarts? The questions hung in the air like the lingering scent of the mysterious potion, promising that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than a simple classroom mishap. What other secrets were hiding within the castle walls, waiting for another fortunate accident to bring them to light? The autumn wind whispered through the corridors of Hogwarts, carrying with it something more than just fallen leaves, a peculiar melodic sound that seemed to catch the attention of students and faculty alike. Ever since Barnaby's explosive mishap in potions class last week, things at Hogwarts had taken an unusual turn. Evelina Hawthorne sat in the Gryffindor common room, trying to focus on her Transfiguration essay, but the distant humming from beyond the castle walls kept drawing her attention. "Do you hear that?" she asked Milo Fenwick, who had joined her for their usual study session. Milo adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his face showing concern. "I've been hearing it for days now. It's like someone singing, but not quite human." He pulled out his notebook, where he'd been documenting the occurrences. Have you noticed how many students have been caught trying to sneak into the Forbidden Forest lately? Indeed, the number of detention slips have tripled in the past week. Even the usually rule-abiding Ravenclaws have been found wandering dangerously close to the forest's edge. Professor Moonshadow had been working overtime, intercepting students before they could venture too far. "It's getting stronger," Sapphire Blakely announced, appearing suddenly behind them. Her presence in the Gryffindor common room would normally raise eyebrows, but recent events had broken down some of the house barriers. "Last night, I found 3 first-years sleepwalking toward the forest. If I hadn't stopped them..." She left the sentence hanging ominously. Evelina noticed dark circles under Sapphire's eyes, matching her own exhaustion. The calling had been affecting their sleep, weaving into their dreams like silver threads of an enchanted tapestry. But what was most concerning was how Malachite Wraithstone seemed completely unaffected, often watching his fellow students with an unsettling smile. "Professor Plum knows something," Milo said quietly, closing his notebook. "I saw him yesterday, having an intense discussion with Professor Moonshadow. He kept pointing at the forest and mentioning something about a cycle and awakening." Barnaby Twidlethon stumbled into the common room, his robes covered in dirt. "I tried to resist it," he stammered. "But it's like the forest knows our names. It's calling us personally." His usually cheerful face was pale with worry. Evelina helped Barnaby into a chair, her mind racing. Could this be connected to his potion's accident? The explosion had released an unusual purple mist that had dissipated before anyone could analyze it. But what if it had triggered something ancient, something that had been dormant in the forest? "We need to talk to Professor Plum," Evelina declared, but Sapphire shook her head. "He's disappeared," she revealed, causing everyone to lean in closer. "No one's seen him since his argument with Professor Moonshadow. And here's the strange part. All his personal plants in the greenhouse have started blooming out of season, all pointing toward the forest like they're being pulled by an invisible force." The calling grew louder, more insistent. Through the window, they could see other students gathering in the courtyard, their faces turned toward the darkening tree line. Professor Moonshadow was trying to herd them back inside, but for every student she redirected, 2 more seemed to appear. "There's something else," Milo added, his voice barely above a whisper. "In divination class, I had a vision. I saw Professor Plum standing in a clearing, surrounded by floating lights. He was saying something about balance and the price of ancient magic." Evelina felt a chill run down her spine as she remembered something she'd read in an old textbook about magical resonance, how certain combinations of magical elements could awaken dormant enchantments. Had Barnaby's accident somehow struck the right chord? The group watched as Malachite Wraithstone crossed the courtyard below, moving with purpose toward Professor Moonshadow. Even from a distance, they could see the intense discussion that followed, with Malachite gesturing emphatically and the professor's face growing increasingly concerned. "Whatever's happening," Evelina said, standing up with determination, "we need to figure it out before someone gets hurt. The forest isn't just calling anymore, it's demanding an audience." As if in response to her words, the humming intensified, and several students pressed their hands to their ears. In the greenhouse, visible from their window, the magical plants began to sway in unison, their blooms glowing with an otherworldly light. "But how do we fight something we can't see?" Barnaby asked, his voice trembling. "How do we resist a call that seems to know our deepest desires?" The question hung in the air as the group exchanged worried glances. The forest's call had become more than just a mysterious phenomenon. It had become a test of will, a challenge to their understanding of magic itself. And somewhere in the depths of those ancient trees, Professor Plum held answers that could either save them or reveal a truth they might not be ready to face. As night fell over Hogwarts, the calling grew stronger, and the line between resistance and surrender became increasingly blurred. Who would be the next to answer the forest's call? And more importantly, what would they find when they did? The autumn wind whistled through the corridors of Hogwarts, carrying with it whispers of unease. Evelina Hawthorne sat in the library, her potions textbook forgotten as she observed Malachi Wraithstone from across the room. Something had changed in him since the strange occurrences in the Forbidden Forest began. The way his left hand constantly clutched his right forearm hadn't gone unnoticed by her keen eyes. "Have you noticed?" Milo Fenwick whispered, sliding into the seat beside her. "The symbols that appear on the castle walls every morning. They vanish before the professors can study them, but I've been sketching them." He pulled out a worn parchment filled with intricate drawings. Evelina's eyes widened as she recognized one of the symbols. She had seen it briefly when Malachi's sleeve had slipped during Transfiguration class. "Milo, these aren't just random markings. They're connected to him somehow." Their hushed conversation was interrupted by Sapphire Blakely, who approached their table with unusual urgency. "You need to see this," she said, her typical swagger replaced by genuine concern. She led them to an abandoned classroom where Barnaby Tweedleton was already waiting, nervously fidgeting with his wand. "I saw something last night," Barnaby stammered. "I was practicing levitation spells after hours. Please don't tell Professor Moonshadow. When I saw Malachi in the courtyard, he was glowing." The revelation sparked a memory in Evelina's mind. Professor Plum's words from their last herbology lesson suddenly made sense. Sometimes the darkest roots produce the most luminous blooms, but at what cost to the garden? As they pieced together their observations, Professor Moonshadow burst into the classroom, her usually composed demeanor slightly rattled. "Miss Hawthorne, Mr. Fenwick, come with me immediately. Professor Plum has made a disturbing discovery in the Forbidden Forest." At the forest's edge, Professor Plum stood examining a tree marked with the same symbols from Milo's drawings. But these weren't vanishing. They pulsed with an eerie green light. "The forest remembers," he murmured, running his fingers over the bark. "It remembers the last time these marks appeared 50 years ago." The truth began unfolding like a complex puzzle. Malachi's arrival at Hogwarts wasn't coincidental. His family, the Wraithstones, had been guardians of an ancient magic that bridged the gap between the living world and something far more sinister. The marks on his arm weren't just symbols. They were a birthright, a curse passed down through generations. But what was calling from the Forbidden Forest? And why now? Sapphire, who had followed them despite Professor Moonshadow's protests, shared what she had learned from her own investigations. The Wraithstone family disappeared 50 years ago, right after the last appearance of these symbols. Everyone thought they were dead until Malachi showed up this year. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was troubling. The voices from the forest, the mysterious symbols, Malachi's strange behavior. They were all connected to an ancient pact made between his family and creatures that dwelled in the darkest parts of the magical world. Professor Plum's usual riddling manner gave way to direct concern. "The barriers between worlds are thinning. The marks are a warning, but they're also a key. Young Wraithstone may not be our enemy, but his presence here has awakened something that should have remained dormant." As if in response to his words, a haunting melody drifted from the forest depths. Barnaby, who had insisted on coming alone, grabbed Evelina's hand in fear. "The voices, they're getting stronger." Evelina felt torn between fear and fascination. She had always been drawn to magical mysteries, but this one carried real danger. Looking at her friends' faces, Milo's analytical frown, Sapphire's determined expression, and Barnaby's wide-eyed worry, she knew they were all in this together. Professor Moonshadow drew her wand, her voice stern but not unkind. "Whatever is happening, we must act quickly. The last time these marks appeared, 3 students vanished without a trace. We cannot allow history to repeat itself." As they headed back to the castle, Evelina caught sight of Malachi watching from the astronomy tower. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment she saw not the brooding, mysterious student, but someone carrying a burden too heavy for their young shoulders. The question wasn't whether Malachi was good or evil. It was whether they could help him prevent whatever catastrophe that was approaching. But with the forest's call growing stronger and the symbols spreading throughout the castle, time was running out. What secrets did the Wraithstone family protect for centuries? Could they trust Malachi to help them, or was he bound by forces beyond his control? As night fell over Hogwarts, these questions hung in the air like the mist rising from the forbidden forest, where ancient magic stirred and waited. The flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows along the ancient stone walls as Evelina Hawthorne and Milo Fenwick stood before what appeared to be an ordinary wall in the castle's lesser-travelled eastern wing. But they knew better. The events of the past few weeks, particularly the revelations about Malachi's mysterious markings, had led them to this moment. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Evie?" Milo whispered, his voice trembling slightly as he clutched his worn leather-bound notebook. "If Professor Moonshadow catches us here after curfew..." Evelina traced her fingers along the intricate pattern she'd noticed earlier that day. A series of seemingly random scratches that, when viewed from the right angle, formed a constellation she recognized from their astronomy classes. Remember what Professor Plum said in herbology last week? About how the castle's deepest secrets often hide in plain sight. The memory of Professor Plum's cryptic words during their venomous tentacular lesson came flooding back. He'd been unusually distracted that day, his normally cheerful demeanor replaced by something more contemplative. "The marks we bear," he'd said, looking directly at Malachi, "often lead us to the truths we seek." As Evelina pressed her hand against the cool stone, Milo suddenly grabbed her arm. "Wait, look at this." He held up his notebook, pages fluttering to reveal his meticulous notes about the symbols they'd seen on Malachi's wrist during their last defense against the Dark Arts class. "Don't you see? The constellation pattern matches exactly." Could it be mere coincidence that the same symbols appearing on their mysterious new classmate were now manifesting in the castle's architecture? What connection could there be between Malachi Wraithstone and this hidden section of Hogwarts? Before they could ponder further, a soft blue light began emanating from the wall, pulsing in rhythm with their heartbeats. The stone seemed to liquefy, revealing a narrow passageway that descended into darkness. "Well," Evelina said, drawing her wand, "I suppose there's only one way to find out where this leads. Lumos." As they ventured deeper into the passage, the air grew thick with ancient magic. Their footsteps echoed off walls that seemed to whisper secrets in forgotten languages. The passage eventually opened into a circular chamber that took their breath away. Artifacts of incredible power and mystery filled the room. Ancient tomes bound in materials they'd never seen before lined the walls. Crystals of varying sizes and colours hung suspended in midair, each emanating a different magical frequency. But what drew their attention most was a peculiar mirror standing in the centre of the room, its surface rippling like liquid silver. "This is incredible," Milo breathed, his natural curiosity overcoming his usual caution. "But why here? Why now?" Their exploration was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the passage behind them. They quickly ducked behind a large cabinet, hearts pounding. To their surprise, it was Sapphire Blakely who entered the chamber, followed closely by none other than Malachi Wraithstone himself. "I told you it would work," Sapphire said, her voice carrying a mix of triumph and concern. "The symbols led us right to it, just as you said they would." Malachi moved directly to the mirror, his usually stoic expression replaced by something almost like fear. "It's been here all along," he murmured, "right under their noses." What happened next would change everything they thought they knew about their new classmate. Malachi rolled up his sleeve, revealing the full extent of his markings. As he raised his arm toward the mirror, the symbols began to glow with the same blue light that had revealed the passage. The mirror's surface began to swirl violently, and a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere spoke words in an ancient tongue that made the very air crackle with power. Evelina and Milo exchanged glances, their minds racing with questions. What was this place? What was Malachi's connection to it? And most importantly, what would happen when the mirror finished its mysterious transformation? Just then, they heard another set of footsteps approaching. Professor Moonshadow's voice echoed down the passage, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of Professor Plum's hurried stride. "It's happening sooner than we feared, Thaddeus. The signs are unmistakable." As Sapphire and Malachi scrambled to hide, and Evelina and Milo pressed themselves further into the shadows, one thing became crystal clear. They had stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple secret chamber. The real question was, were they ready for the consequences of what they were about to discover? The chamber seemed to pulse with anticipation as the footsteps grew closer, and the mirror's surface continued its hypnotic dance. Whatever was about to happen would undoubtedly change the course of their year at Hogwarts, and perhaps the fate of the magical world itself. The great hall's enchanted ceiling flickered unusually during breakfast, catching everyone's attention. The normally steady magical projection of the sky above wavered, showing brief glimpses of unfamiliar constellations that shouldn't be visible during daylight hours. Professor Celeste Moonshadow stood at the staff table, her usually composed demeanor showing signs of concern as she observed the phenomenon. "Did you see that?" Evelina whispered to Milo, who was absorbed in his morning porridge. "The stars. They're not right." Milo looked up, his eyes widening as he witnessed another fluctuation. "Those patterns. I've seen them in my divination readings, but they shouldn't be appearing now. Something's interfering with the castle's magic." At the Slytherin table, Sapphire Blakely caught Evelina's eye, giving her a meaningful look. She wasn't the only one who noticed the strange occurrences. Nearby, Malachi Wraithstone sat alone, his dark eyes fixed intently on the ceiling, a knowing expression on his face that made Evelina's skin prickle with unease. Professor Moonshadow called an emergency staff meeting, but not before Evelina overheard her discussing the matter with Professor Plum. "Thaddeus, these aren't ordinary astronomical disturbances. The last time I saw something similar was during the Great Magical Convergence of 1832. "Indeed, Celeste," Professor Plum replied, twirling his silver-streaked beard thoughtfully. "The forest creatures have been restless too. Perhaps it's connected to what Miss Hawthorne and Mr. Fenwick discovered in that hidden chamber." The mention of the secret room they'd found made Evelina's heart race. The ancient artifacts they'd discovered there had seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Could they be responsible for these celestial anomalies? Later that day, during Transfiguration class, Professor Moonshadow struggled to demonstrate a simple transformation spell. The usually flawless professor found her magic behaving erratically, much to everyone's surprise. Class dismissed, she announced abruptly, her voice tight with frustration. As students filed out, Barnaby Twiddleton tripped over his own feet, sending his books flying. "Oh no, not again," he moaned. Evelina helped him gather his things, noticing a strange symbol glowing faintly on one of his textbooks, a symbol she'd seen in the hidden chamber. "Milo," she called out, "look at this." But before she could show him, the symbol faded away. That evening, Evelina, Milo, and Sapphire met secretly in the library's restricted section. "The stars are trying to tell us something," Milo explained, spreading out his star charts. "These patterns, they're forming a message." "Or a warning," Sapphire added, her usual confidence tinged with worry. "My father used to say that when the stars behave strangely, ancient magic is stirring." Their research was interrupted by a commotion outside. Students were gathering at the windows, pointing at the sky. The real stars had become visible despite it being early evening, and they were moving, forming shapes and patterns that defied astronomical logic. Professor Moonshadow's voice echoed through the castle. All students returned to their common rooms immediately. But Evelina couldn't move. She stood transfixed as the stars seemed to dance above Hogwarts. A particular constellation caught her attention. It matched exactly with a marking she'd seen on one of the artifacts in the hidden chamber. "We need to go back there," she declared to Milo and Sapphire. "Whatever's happening, those artifacts are connected to it." "Count me in," came a voice from the shadows. Malachi Wraithstone stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "I know more about those artifacts than you might think." The group exchanged uncertain glances. Could they trust Malachi? What did he know about the artifacts? And more importantly, what were the stars trying to tell them? As if in response to their questions, the castle trembled slightly, and the magical torches lining the corridors flickered in unison. Professor Plum's words from earlier echoed in Evelina's mind. The forest creatures were restless. What did they sense coming? In the distance, a phoenix's cry pierced the night, and the stars above Hogwarts continued their mysterious dance. The ancient magic of the castle seemed to be responding to something, but what? And why now? The answers, Evelina suspected, lay in that hidden chamber. But with the castle's magic behaving unpredictably and Professor Moonshadow on high alert, getting back there wouldn't be easy. Yet as she looked at her friends' determined faces, she knew they had to try. The celestial signs were clear. Something momentous was about to happen at Hogwarts, and they were somehow meant to be part of it. What secrets did the moving stars hold? How were the artifacts connected to these astronomical anomalies? And most intriguingly, what did Malachi Wraithstone know that he wasn't telling them? The answers to these questions would soon change everything they thought they knew about magic itself. The Great Hall buzzed with unusual tension that morning. Students huddled in whispered conversations, their faces etched with concern. Evelina Hawthorne sat at the Gryffindor table, her breakfast untouched as she watched yet another first year's wand sputter and die while attempting a simple levitation charm. "That's the 7th one this week," Milo Fenwick whispered, sliding onto the bench beside her. His own wand lay carefully wrapped in silk, a precaution many students had begun taking. "Something's not right, Evelina. Even the most basic spells are failing." Across the hall, Professor Celeste Moonshadow's usually composed demeanour showed signs of strain as she consulted with other faculty members. The sight of their worried expressions only heightened the students' anxiety. "Did you see what happened in Professor Plum's class yesterday?" Barnaby Twiddleton chimed in, nearly knocking over his pumpkin juice in excitement. All the screaming snapdragons went completely silent, just like that. He snapped his fingers, accidentally sending sparks from his wand that fizzled pathetically. Evelina's attention was drawn to the Slytherin table, where Sapphire Blakely sat alone, methodically testing her wand with increasingly complex spells. Each attempt seemed weaker than the last. Their eyes met briefly, and for once, Sapphire's usual smugness was replaced with genuine concern. "It's not just the wands." Malachi Wraithstone's deep voice startled them as he appeared behind their group. "The very magic in the castle feels wrong, like a song that's slowly going out of tune." His dark eyes fixed on something distant, something only he seemed to see. The situation reached a breaking point during Transfiguration class. Professor Moonshadow attempted to demonstrate a complex transformation spell, only to have her own wand, a legendary instrument known for its reliability, cracked down the middle with a sound like breaking glass. The class fell silent. Professor Moonshadow stared at her broken wand in disbelief, her hands trembling slightly. "Class dismissed," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Evelina couldn't move. Her mind was racing, connecting dots that had been floating just out of reach. The failing spells, the silent magical creatures, the weakening protective enchantments around the castle. "It's a curse," she breathed, causing Milo to turn sharply toward her. But who would have the power to curse all of Hogwarts? Professor Thaddeus Plum appeared in the doorway, his usually cheerful face grave. "Not who, Miss Hawthorne," he said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. "But what? Some curses are older than the castle itself." As if to emphasize his words, the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall flickered ominously, its magical illusion of the sky above beginning to fade. Sapphire approached their group, setting aside old rivalries in the face of this greater threat. "The library," she said decisively. "We need to research magical failures throughout Hogwarts history." "I've been having dreams," Milo admitted quietly. "Dark dreams about the castle's foundations. I thought they were just anxiety about exams, but now..." Malachi's expression darkened. The castle's magic is tied to something deeper, something fundamental. If we don't find a way to stop this curse, Hogwarts itself might cease to exist as a magical institution. The gravity of his words hung heavy in the air. Barnaby clutched his wand tighter, looking up at Evelina with trust in his eyes. "We can fix this, right?" Evelina looked around at her assembled companions, Milo's analytical mind already working on the problem, Sapphire's determination, Malachi's dark knowledge, and Barnaby's unwavering faith. Even as another chandelier's magical lights flickered and died above them, she felt a spark of hope. "We have to," she said firmly. "But first, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Professor Plum, you know more than you're telling us, don't you?" The herbology professor's eyes twinkled mysteriously. "Perhaps. But knowledge, like magic itself, can be dangerous when revealed too quickly. The question you should be asking, Miss Hawthorne, is not what is causing the curse, but why now? What has awakened something so ancient?" As if in response to his words, a cold wind swept through the corridor, carrying with it the scent of ancient stone and forgotten magic. The portraits on the walls shuddered, their magical inhabitants growing still and silent. "We're running out of time," Sapphire observed, her usual confidence tinged with urgency. "Whatever this curse is, it's growing stronger." "Then we better start looking for answers," Evelina declared, already heading toward the library. "Before there's no magic left to save." The group followed her, each lost in their own thoughts about what might lie ahead. As they walked, none of them noticed the shadow that seemed to move independently along the walls, or the way the castle's very stones seemed to pulse with a dark, ancient rhythm. What ancient force had awakened beneath Hogwarts? And more importantly, could a group of students, led by their determination and friendship, find a way to save their beloved school before all magic faded from its halls forever? The race against time had begun, and the fate of Hogwarts hung in the balance. The great hall's enchanted ceiling reflected the tumultuous storm brewing outside, mirroring the conflict raging within Sapphire Blakely's mind. She sat at the Slytherin table, pushing her untouched breakfast around her plate, while stealing glances at Malachi Wraithstone, who sat in his usual isolated corner. What would you do if you discovered that someone you were drawn to might be orchestrating the destruction of everything you held dear? The events of the past week weighed heavily on Sapphire's conscience. The curse affecting Hogwarts had grown stronger, and she now knew why. Late one night, she had followed Malachi to the 7th floor, where she witnessed him performing an ancient ritual, one that was gradually unraveling the school's protective enchantments. "You look troubled," Evelina Hawthorne's voice cut through Sapphire's thoughts as she approached the Slytherin table, an unusual occurrence that drew curious glances from other students. Despite their complicated history, Evelina had noticed the change in Sapphire's typically confident demeanour. "Not everyone needs your Gryffindor heroics, Hawthorne," Sapphire replied, but her words lacked their usual bite. She found herself wondering if Evelina had ever faced a similar moral dilemma. How do you choose between protecting someone you care about and doing what's right? Meanwhile, Milo Fenwick observed the interaction from the Ravenclaw table, his keen intuition telling him something was amiss. He'd have been researching the recent magical failures and had discovered an ancient text about magical bonds being corrupted by dark rituals. The pieces were starting to fit together, but he needed more information. Professor Celeste Moonshadow swept through the hall, her sharp eyes noting the unusual dynamics playing out before her. She paused briefly near Sapphire, sensing the internal struggle of her student. "Miss Blakely, remember that our choices define us more than our abilities," she said cryptically before continuing to the staff table. The day's classes proceeded with an air of tension. During defense against the dark arts, Sapphire excelled as usual, but her spells seemed to carry an edge of desperation. Malachi watched her with those intense eyes that had first drawn her in, eyes that now seemed to hold darker secrets than she'd initially realized. During herbology, Professor Plum's usually cheerful demeanor was subdued as he lectured about plants that could detect dark magic. "Nature has a way of warning us about impending doom," he said, looking pointedly at Sapphire. "The question is, are we brave enough to heed those warnings?" As evening approached, Barnaby Twiddleton accidentally crashed into Sapphire in the corridor, spilling his armful of books. As she helped him gather them, she noticed one titled Loyalty and Legacy, A Wizard's True North. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Sorry, Sapphire," Barnaby squeaked. "I was just trying to find something to help with all the weird magic happening lately. Even my Lumos charm turned my hair blue yesterday." His innocent concern for the school's well-being struck a chord with Sapphire. Later that night, Sapphire found herself in the astronomy tower, where she often went to think. The stars seemed to mock her indecision. She pulled out a letter Malachi had given her, explaining his actions. His words spoke of a greater purpose, of righting ancient wrongs, but at what cost? A soft footstep behind her revealed Evelina, who had followed her. "I know about Malachi," Evelina said quietly. "And I know you're trying to protect him." Sapphire's hand tightened around her wand. "You don't understand anything, Hawthorne." "Then help me understand," Evelina replied, sitting beside her former rival. "Because right now, Hogwarts is falling apart, and you might be the only one who can stop it." As they talked through the night, Sapphire began to see the bigger picture. Malachi's pain was real, His family had suffered greatly during the last Wizarding War, but his method of seeking justice would harm countless innocent students. The next morning, as students gathered for breakfast, Sapphire stood at the entrance of the Great Hall, watching Malachai approach. Her decision crystallized in that moment. Would she choose the path of loyalty to one or protection of many? With a deep breath, she raised her wand. "I'm sorry, Malachai," she whispered, before casting a revealing charm that exposed his dark ritual materials to everyone present. The hall erupted in chaos as Professor Moonshadow and other teachers rushed forward. As Malachai was led away, his eyes met Sapphire's. In them, she saw not anger, but a glimmer of understanding. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that break our own hearts. The curse began to lift from Hogwarts, but the weight of her decision would stay with Sapphire. She'd had chosen to protect her school, her fellow students, and ultimately the greater good. But at what personal cost? And would Malachai's capture truly end the threats facing Hogwarts? Or was this just the beginning of a larger storm brewing on the horizon? The evening air hung heavy with anticipation as Evelina, Milo, and Sapphire gathered in Professor Plum's private greenhouse. The events of the past few days had left them all shaken, particularly Sapphire, whose decision to warn them about Malachai's true intentions had come at a great personal cost. The greenhouse, usually a place of comfort and familiar herbal scents, felt different tonight, more mysterious, more ancient somehow. Professor Plum stood before them, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by an uncharacteristic solemnity. "I suppose," he began, absently stroking a nearby whispering willow, "it's time I told you why I truly came to Hogwarts all those years ago." The plant seemed to lean into his touch, its leaves rustling with secrets of their own. "You mean you didn't come just to teach herbology?" Barnaby, who had insisted on joining them despite the late hour, asked with wide-eyed curiosity. Thaddeus Plum smiled sadly. "Teaching was always my passion, young Barnaby, but it wasn't my primary purpose." He reached into his weathered robes and pulled out an ancient-looking journal, its pages yellow with age and covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and change as they watched. 30 years ago, I was just a young wizard studying rare magical plants in the forests of Eastern Europe. That's where I first encountered the prophecy of the Green Dawn." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "And that's where I first learned about the Wraithstone legacy." Sapphire straightened at the mention of Malachai's family name. "What does this have to do with Malachai?" Professor Plum began to pace, his footsteps echoing against the glass walls of the greenhouse. The Wraithstones weren't always associated with dark magic. Centuries ago, they were guardians of an ancient balance between the natural world and the magical one. They possessed a unique ability to communicate with magical plants and creatures in ways that other wizards couldn't. But something changed, didn't it? Evelina asked, her mind racing with connections she was beginning to piece together. "Indeed, Miss Hawthorne. The family became corrupted by the very power they were meant to protect. All except one branch of the family who continued to honor the old ways. I believe young Malachai represents the convergence of both lines, the darkness and the light." Milo, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up sharply. The strange events in the Forbidden Forest, the dying magical creatures, the withering plants, it's all connected to this, isn't it? "Very perceptive, Mr. Fenwick," Professor Plum nodded. "The prophecy speaks of a time when the balance would be threatened by one who carries both gifts. The power to heal and the power to destroy, housed in a single vessel." "Malachai," Sapphire whispered, her face pale with understanding. Professor Plum opened his journal, revealing pages of intricate drawings and notes. I came to Hogwarts because the prophecy indicated this would be where the crucial moment would occur. I spent decades preparing, studying every magical plant that might help us when the time came. But why tell us now? Evelina asked, her voice trembling slightly. Because, my dear students, the signs are clear. The moment the prophecy spoke of is approaching, and you four have been chosen by fate to play crucial roles. He turned to each of them in turn. Evelina's gift with potions, Milo's talent for solving magical puzzles, Sapphire's understanding of dark magic, and yes, even young Barnaby's pure heart. All will be necessary. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the greenhouse, causing the plants to shudder and sway. Professor Moonshadow appeared at the entrance, her expression grave. Thaddeus, it's happening. The forest, it's beginning to change. The students rushed to the windows, and what they saw made their blood run cold. The forbidden forest was glowing with an eerie green light, and dark clouds were gathering above it in an unnatural spiral. Professor Plum's voice was heavy with the weight of decades of preparation. The question now isn't just about stopping Malachi. It's about saving him from himself. The prophecy speaks of a choice that must be made, but it doesn't tell us what that choice will be. What do we do now? Barnaby asked, his usual cheerfulness replaced by determination. Now, Professor Plum said, pulling out a small glowing seed from his pocket, we prepare for what comes next. The plants have been whispering warnings for months. They speak of a ritual that Malachi plans to perform during the next full moon, 3 days from now. Evelina felt a shiver run down her spine, the same night as the centennial blooming of the moonflower in the heart of the forbidden forest. Exactly, Professor Plum confirmed. And that's no coincidence. The moonflower's rare bloom holds immense power. Power that could either restore the balance or destroy it forever. As they stood there, absorbing the weight of this revelation, each of them knew their lives at Hogwarts would never be the same. The comfortable world of classes and house points seemed very far away now, replaced by something far more ancient and dangerous. But there's still hope, Professor Plum added, seeing their worried faces. The prophecy speaks of another power, one that even the Wraithstones couldn't fully understand. It's a power that resides in the most unexpected places, in the choices we make and the bonds we forge. As if in response to his words, the Whispering Willow's leaves rustled again, and this time they could almost make out words in the sound, a song of ancient magic and the promise of dawn after the darkest night. The question that hung in the air, unspoken but heavy in their minds, was whether they would be strong enough to face what was coming. And more importantly, could they save both Hogwarts and Malachi before it was too late? The autumn wind whistled through the corridors of Hogwarts as Milo Fenwick jolted awake in his Ravenclaw dormitory, his heart pounding against his chest like a trapped snitch. The dream that had haunted his sleep was unlike anything he'd experienced before, more vivid, more terrifying, and undeniably prophetic. Evelina, he whispered into the darkness, knowing he needed to find his friend immediately, regardless of the hour. But how could he explain what he'd seen? The images of shadow and flame, the twisted forms of creatures that shouldn't exist, and most disturbing of all, the sight of Professor Plum standing at the edge of the forbidden forest, his usually kind face contorted in anguish. As Milo hurried through the empty corridors, his footsteps echoing against the ancient stones, he nearly collided with Sapphire Blakely, who was suspiciously emerging from behind a tapestry. "Watch where you're going, Fenwick," she hissed, but then paused, noting his pale face and trembling hands. "You've seen something, haven't you?" Before Milo could respond, a familiar voice called out, "Mr. Fenwick, Miss Blakely. What brings you both out of bed at this unseemly hour?" Professor Moonshadow emerged from the shadows, her silver robes gleaming in the moonlight. "Professor," Milo stammered, "I need to find Evelina. It's urgent. I've had a vision, and I think it's connected to what Professor Plum told us about the prophecy." Professor Moonshadow's stern expression softened slightly. "Follow me, both of you. Miss Hawthorne is already in my office. She too seems to have had a rather disturbing night." As they entered the office, they found Evelina pacing nervously, while Barnaby Twiddleton sat in a corner, clutching his pet toad and looking more anxious than usual. "Milo!" Evelina exclaimed. "Thank goodness you're here. Something's wrong with Professor Plum. He's been acting strange since our last conversation about the prophecy, and now." "Now what?" Sapphire demanded, her usual confidence tinged with concern. "He's gone," Barnaby piped up, his voice quavering. "I saw him heading into the Forbidden Forest an hour ago, muttering something about setting things right, and before it's too late." Milo's heart sank. "That's what I saw in my vision. Professor Plum in the forest. But he wasn't alone. There was someone else, or something else, waiting for him. And Malachi Wraithstone was there too, but he seemed different." "Malachi?" Sapphire's face paled. "I knew there was something off about him. He's been asking strange questions about the forest's ancient magic, and I've seen him practicing spells I've never encountered before." Professor Moonshadow raised her hand for silence. "Mr. Fenwick, tell us exactly what you saw in your vision. Every detail could be crucial." As Milo recounted his dream, the room grew colder, and the candles flickered ominously. He described the ancient stones arranged in a circle deep in the forest, the strange symbols that glowed with an eerie blue light, and the shadow that seemed to take form and substance. "But the most frightening part," Milo continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "was what Professor Plum said in the vision. He spoke of a debt that must be paid, a balance that must be restored. And he mentioned something called the binding that happens only once every century, when the veil between our world and something else grows thin." Evelina's eyes widened. "The ancient texts in the restricted section, the ones Professor Plum helped me access, they mentioned the binding. It's supposed to happen on the night of the blood moon, which is tomorrow night." Professor Moonshadow finished grimly. "This is graver than I feared. The last time the binding was attempted, 3 wizards lost their lives, and something dark nearly broke through into our world." "But why would Professor Plum be involved?" Barnaby asked, hugging his toad closer. "He's always been so kind and helpful." Sapphire's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Unless he's trying to prevent something worse from happening. Remember what he said about the prophecy? About a choice that would have to be made." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. What if Professor Plum's mysterious past was somehow connected to the binding? What if his knowledge of magical creatures and his deep connection to the forest weren't just academic interests, but preparation for this very moment? "We have to help him," Evelina declared, her voice firm despite her obvious fear. "But we need to know more. Milo, do you think you could try to induce another vision? Maybe see more details about what's coming?" Milo hesitated. Forcing a vision was dangerous, and the last one had left him feeling drained and vulnerable. But as he looked at his friends' worried faces, he knew they were running out of options. "I'll try," he agreed, "but I'll need help. Sapphire, your knowledge of defense against the dark arts might be useful. And Evelina, your potions expertise could help enhance my natural abilities." Professor Moonshadow paced the room, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is highly irregular, and under normal circumstances, I would forbid any student involvement in such dangerous matters. However, she paused, looking at each of them in turn. These are not normal circumstances, and you five seem to be inexplicably bound to these events. As the first rays of dawn began to creep through the windows, the group began formulating their plan. But questions lingered in everyone's minds. What was Professor Plum really planning? What role did Malachi Wraithstone play in all of this? And most importantly, could they unravel the mystery of the binding before it was too late? The clock was ticking, and somewhere in the Forbidden Forest, ancient powers were stirring. Would Milo's next vision provide the answers they desperately needed? Or would it reveal horrors better left unseen? Only time would tell, and time was running out. The evening shadows stretched across Hogwarts' ancient corridors as Barnaby Twiddleton found himself, yet again, hopelessly lost in the castle's labyrinthine passages. His round, cherubic face was flushed with embarrassment. How was it possible to get lost on the way to the Great Hall after nearly a full year at school? The moving staircases hadn't helped, of course, and now he stood in a corridor he'd never seen before, clutching his worn copy of A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration close to his chest. "Hello," he called out timidly, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Is anyone there?" The silence that answered was deafening, but then, what was that? A whisper, barely audible, seemed to drift from behind a tapestry depicting a medieval wizard's duel. Barnaby's natural Hufflepuff instincts told him to find a prefect or teacher, but something else, something stronger, pulled him toward the sound. Meanwhile, in the Gryffindor common room, Evelina Hawthorne was pacing frantically, her mind racing with the implications of Milo's recent vision. "We have to do something," she muttered to herself, when suddenly the portrait hole burst open, revealing a breathless Sapphire Blakely. "Have you seen Barnaby?" Sapphire demanded, her usually composed demeanour showing cracks of genuine concern. "He was supposed to meet me for tutoring in defence against the dark arts an hour ago." Before Evelina could respond, Milo Fenwick came rushing down from the boys' dormitory, his face pale. "Another vision," he gasped. "I saw Barnaby. He's found something important." Back in the mysterious corridor, Barnaby had discovered more than he bargained for. Behind the tapestry was a narrow passage, and at its end he could hear voices, one of them unmistakably belonging to Malachi Wraithstone. The young Hufflepuff pressed himself against the wall, his heart thundering in his chest. The alignment approaches. Malachi was saying to someone Barnaby couldn't see. When the celestial bodies align, the veil between worlds will be at its thinnest. That's when we must act. "And the boy?" asked a second voice, one that sent chills down Barnaby's spine. "The one from your house, Fenwick. His visions are becoming stronger. He suspects something, but he doesn't understand what he's seeing." Barnaby's foot slipped slightly, causing a tiny scraping sound against the stone floor. The voices immediately fell silent. Panic seized him, but instead of running, he did something that would later make Evelina burst with pride. He transformed his fear into courage. Quickly, he pulled out his wand and whispered a spell he'd been practicing with Evelina, Memoriam Capture. It was a simple charm designed to preserve a memory in crystal clarity, something she'd taught him for exam preparation. Now it might prove far more valuable. As footsteps approached his hiding place, Barnaby made a decision. He burst from behind the tapestry, pretending to be completely lost and confused, which, to be fair, wasn't much of a stretch. "Oh, Professor Moonshadow. I've been looking everywhere for the Great Hall," he exclaimed, seeing Professor Celeste Moonshadow standing there alone. Malachi was nowhere to be seen. The Transfiguration Professor's expression was unreadable. Mr. Twiddleton, This is a restricted area. How did you find your way here? I'm sorry, Professor. The stairs moved, and then I followed a cat I thought might be Mrs. Norris, but it turned out to be just a regular cat. And then I got turned around, and he rambled, playing up his usual scattered personality. Professor Moonshadow's stern face softened slightly. Come, I'll escort you to the Great Hall myself. As they walked, Barnaby's mind raced. What had he just discovered? Why was Malachi meeting with a professor in a hidden passage? And what did they want with Milo? When they finally reached the Great Hall, he found Evelina, Sapphire, and Milo waiting anxiously. The moment Professor Moonshadow left, Barnaby burst into an excited whisper. You won't believe what I just heard. But wait, we need Professor Plum. He needs to know about this too. Evelina exchanged worried glances with her friends. Barnaby, what exactly did you hear? The young Hufflepuff took a deep breath, his usual clumsiness forgotten in the gravity of the moment. Something about celestial alignment and the veil between worlds, and he paused, looking at Milo. They're very interested in your visions. Milo's face went even paler, just like in my dream. The stars aligning, the thinning veil. He trailed off, his hands shaking slightly. Sapphire's eyes narrowed. We need to find Professor Plum now. But we have to be careful. We don't know who we can trust anymore. As they hurried toward the greenhouses where Professor Plum could usually be found, none of them noticed the shadow that detached itself from the wall and followed silently behind them. Nor did they see the knowing smile that played across Malachi Wraithstone's face as he watched them go. What secrets lay behind Professor Moonshadow's stern exterior? What was the significance of the celestial alignment Malachi spoke of? And how had Barnaby, the supposedly bumbling first year, managed to stumble upon such crucial information? The answers would soon reveal themselves, but they might not be what anyone expected, least of all the young Hufflepuff who had just proven that courage comes in many forms. The evening shadows stretched across the stone corridors of Hogwarts as Malachi Wraithstone stood alone in the astronomy tower, his dark robes billowing in the cool autumn breeze. The events of the past few hours weighed heavily on his mind, knowing that the time had come to reveal at least some of what he knew. But how much could he safely disclose without compromising everything? His contemplation was interrupted by approaching footsteps. Evelina Hawthorne appeared at the tower entrance, her wand gripped tightly in her hand. Behind her, Sapphire Blakely emerged from the shadows, her usual confident smirk replaced by an expression of grave concern. I knew we'd find you here, Sapphire said, her voice carrying a mix of accusation and curiosity. After what Barnaby overheard, Malachi turned to face them, his dark eyes reflecting the dying sunlight. The young Hufflepuff has quite a talent for being in the right place at the wrong time, doesn't he? He remarked, a hint of amusement in his otherwise serious tone. Evelina stepped forward. No more games, Malachi. We know you're not just another transfer student. What are you really doing at Hogwarts? The air grew thick with tension as Malachi considered his response. In the distance, a flock of Thestrals circled the Forbidden Forest, their skeletal forms visible only to those who had witnessed death. You're right, he finally admitted. I'm not here by chance. I was sent to Hogwarts with a purpose, but it's not what you might think. He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. Have you ever wondered why Professor Plum spends so much time in the Forbidden Forest lately? The question caught both girls off guard. What did Professor Plum have to do with any of this? Just then, Milo Fenwick burst into the tower, out of breath and clutching a piece of parchment. Evelina, you need to see this. He stopped short at the sight of Malachi, his eyes widening with recognition. You know something about this too, don't you, Fenwick? Malachi asked, his voice carrying a knowing tone. Milo hesitated before responding, the signs I've been seeing in divination class. They're all connected to what's happening in the forest, aren't they? Malachi nodded slowly. There's an ancient magic stirring beneath Hogwarts, something that hasn't been awakened for centuries. Professor Plum knows about it, and so does Professor Moonshadow, though they disagree on how to handle it. What kind of magic? Evelina pressed, her curiosity piqued despite her suspicion. The kind that could either save or destroy everything we know, Malachi replied cryptically. I'm part of a group tasked with preventing its misuse, but there are others who seek to harness its power for their own ends. Sapphire crossed her arms. And we're supposed to just believe you. For all we know, you could be working with those others you mentioned. A sad smile crossed Malachi's face. Trust is hard to come by these days, isn't it, Blakely? But consider this. Why would Barnaby have overheard me warning Professor Plum about the danger if I were working against Hogwarts? The question hung in the air as the group processed this information. Suddenly, a distant explosion echoed from the direction of the Forbidden Forest, causing them all to rush to the tower's edge. A column of purple smoke rose above the treetops, and strange lights flickered between the branches. It's starting, Malachi whispered, his face pale. We're running out of time. What's starting? Evelina demanded. What aren't you telling us? Before Malachi could answer, a patroness in the form of a magnificent owl soared into the tower. Professor Moonshadow's voice emanated from it. All students returned to their common rooms immediately. This is not a drill. Listen carefully, Malachi said urgently, because I can only say this once. Beneath Hogwarts lies an ancient nexus of magical ley lines, more powerful than any known to wizard kind. Every 1,000 years, these lines align in a way that could either strengthen or shatter the barriers between our world and others. Others? Milo asked, his voice trembling. You mean like other dimensions? Precisely, Malachi confirmed. And there are creatures in those other dimensions that have been waiting centuries for this moment. Professor Plum has been trying to reinforce the barriers, but someone within Hogwarts is working to weaken them. Another explosion rocked the castle, closer this time. Screams echoed from the corridors below. I've already said too much, Malachi concluded, drawing his wand. But remember this, not everything that appears dark is evil, and not everything that shines is light. Trust your instincts, but question everything you think you know. As if on cue, Barnaby's voice called out from the stairwell, Evelina, Professor Plum needs help in the forest. He sent me to find you. The group exchanged glances, knowing that a crucial decision point had arrived. Should they trust Malachi's warnings? What role did Professor Plum truly play in all this? And most importantly, what would emerge from the Forbidden Forest as the night grew darker? The answers to these questions would have to wait, as the immediate crisis demanded their attention. But one thing was certain. Hogwarts stood on the brink of something unprecedented, and the choices they made in the coming hours would echo through the halls of magical history for generations to come. What dark secrets still lurked in the shadows of Hogwarts? And more importantly, who could they truly trust when the barriers between worlds began to crumble? The revelation of Professor Moonshadow's involvement in the unfolding mystery at Hogwarts began on a stormy evening in the Transfiguration classroom. Evelina Hawthorne found herself staying behind after class, her mind still reeling from Malachi Wraithstone's cryptic warnings about an ancient power stirring within the castle walls. Miss Hawthorne, Professor Moonshadow's voice cut through the silence. I suspect you have questions about Mr. Wraithstone's recent disclosures. The professor's usually stern demeanour seemed to waver slightly as she spoke, her fingers absently tracing the worn edges of an old leather-bound book on her desk. Evelina exchanged glances with Milo Fenwick, who had lingered by the doorway, unwilling to leave his friend alone. "Professor," Evelina began carefully, "Malachi mentioned something about a guardian's oath. He said you would understand." The mention of the oath caused Professor Moonshadow to freeze momentarily. "Did he now?" she whispered, more to herself than to her students. "Perhaps it's time. Yes, it must be time." As thunder rolled outside the castle windows, Professor Moonshadow began to share a tale that would change everything they thought they knew about their stern Transfiguration teacher. She spoke of a secret society within Hogwarts, one that had existed for centuries, dedicated to protecting certain magical artifacts of immense power. 20 years ago, she continued, her voice taking on a distant quality, "I made a choice that would alter the course of many lives, including young Mr. Wraithstone's." Meanwhile, in the corridors outside, Sapphire Blakely pressed herself against the wall, listening intently. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the mention of Malachi had caught her attention. Her heart raced as she heard Professor Moonshadow describe a ritual gone wrong, a protection spell that had backfired with devastating consequences. The story unfolded like a complex tapestry, revealing how Professor Moonshadow and Professor Plum had once been part of the same secret order. Their rivalry, it seemed, stemmed not from professional disagreements, but from a fundamental difference in how they believed these ancient powers should be handled. But what does this have to do with the strange events happening now? Milo asked, his analytical mind already forming connections. Professor Moonshadow's response was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. Barnaby Twiddleton had apparently tripped over his own feet while trying to deliver an urgent message, causing Sapphire to be discovered in her hiding spot. Rather than showing anger at the eavesdropping, Professor Moonshadow simply sighed and beckoned them all inside. "Perhaps it's better this way," she admitted. "The more of you who understand, the better chance we have of preventing history from repeating itself." She revealed how the recent disturbances in the castle's magic were eerily similar to events that had preceded the catastrophe 2 decades ago. The moving staircases becoming erratic, the portraits whispering of dark omens, and the unusual behavior of magical creatures in the Forbidden Forest, all signs they had ignored before. "But Professor," Evelina interjected, "why didn't you tell us this when the problems first started?" The question hung in the air as Professor Moonshadow transformed her desk into a detailed magical projection of Hogwarts, showing various points where the castle's magical barriers were weakening. "Because, Miss Hawthorne, sometimes the truth itself can be dangerous. Knowledge in the wrong hands or at the wrong time can be as destructive as any curse." As she spoke, the projection revealed a pattern that made Milo gasp. The weakening points. They're not random. They're forming a symbol. Indeed, the magical disturbances were creating a pattern that Professor Moonshadow recognized all too well. The same symbol that had appeared during the failed ritual years ago. But what did it mean? And why was it appearing now? The revelation was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Plum, who burst into the classroom with unusual urgency. "Celeste," he said, addressing Professor Moonshadow by her first name, "it's happening again. The forest. It's calling." The students watched in amazement as the two professors, usually so at odds with each other, shared a look of understanding and concern. Whatever their past disagreements, they seemed united in their recognition of the current threat. "What do we do now?" Sapphire asked, her usual confidence replaced by genuine concern. Professor Moonshadow looked at each of the students in turn, her expression both worried and determined. "Now we prepare, because what's coming isn't just a threat to Hogwarts, it's a reckoning with the past itself." As if in response to her words, the magical projection of Hogwarts flickered ominously, casting strange shadows across their faces. The truth had been revealed, but it had only led to more questions. What was the nature of this ancient power? How was Malachai Wraithstone connected to it all? And most importantly, could they prevent the tragedy of 20 years ago from happening again? The storm outside grew stronger, and somewhere in the castle, Malachai Wraithstone watched the same storm, knowing that the time for half-truths and secrets was coming to an end. The question was, would Hogwarts be ready for what was to come? The autumn wind whispered through the ancient trees of the Forbidden Forest, carrying secrets that had remained untold for centuries. Evelina Hawthorne stood at the forest's edge, her wand gripped tightly in her hand, as she processed the shocking revelations about Professor Moonshadow's involvement in the castle's mysterious events. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Milo Fenwick asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The usually composed Ravenclaw student couldn't hide the tremor in his voice as he stood beside his friend. Evelina nodded slowly, her mind racing with the implications of what they had discovered. Professor Moonshadow's diary mentioned a ritual performed in the forest 20 years ago. Whatever's happening in the castle now, it's connected to that night. The conversation was interrupted by the sudden appearance of Professor Thaddeus Plum, who emerged from between two ancient oaks, his robes covered in unusual luminescent moss. "Ah, young minds seeking answers in nature's embrace," he mused, his eyes twinkling with that familiar knowing look. "But have you considered, Miss Hawthorne, that sometimes the forest doesn't reveal its secrets to those who merely look, but to those who listen?" Before Evelina could respond, Sapphire Blakely stepped out from behind a nearby tree, her presence as unexpected as always. "Well, some of us have been listening, Professor," she said, her voice carrying a hint of challenge. "And what we've heard isn't pretty." The tension in the air was palpable as Sapphire shared what she had discovered during her own investigations. She revealed that Malachai Wraithstone had been spotted in the forest multiple times, always during the full moon, and always near the ancient stone circle that few students knew existed. But what does this have to do with Professor Moonshadow? Barnaby Twiddleton piped up, having followed the older students despite being told to stay in the castle. His presence added an unexpected layer of responsibility to their mission. Professor Plum's expression grew serious. The forest remembers young Barnaby. It remembers the night when Celeste Moonshadow and her companions attempted to harness an ancient power, a power that should have remained dormant. As they ventured deeper into the forest, guided by Professor Plum's expertise, Evelina couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches creating patterns that looked almost like written warnings in the dying light. Milo suddenly stopped in his tracks, his gift for divination manifesting in an unexpected vision. "The stones," he guessed, "they're not just markers. They're seals, aren't they, Professor?" Before Professor Plum could answer, a dark figure emerged from the shadows. Malachai Wraithstone stood before them, his usual brooding demeanor replaced by an intensity that made even Sapphire take a step back. "You're right about the seals," Malachai said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed beyond his years. "But you don't understand what's really at stake here. Professor Moonshadow's ritual wasn't just about power, it was about protection." The revelation sparked a heated debate among the group. What were they protecting? And from what? The answers seemed to lie in the very ground beneath their feet, in the ancient magic that pulsed through the forest's roots. As night began to fall, strange lights appeared between the trees, leading them deeper into the forest's heart. The group found themselves drawn to the stone circle, where they discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about Hogwarts history. But what they found there raised even more questions. Why had Professor Moonshadow kept this secret for so long? What role did Malachite play in all of this? And most importantly, what would happen if the seals were broken? The forest held its breath as Evelina and her friends stood at the precipice of a truth that could either save or destroy everything they held dear. The ancient stones hummed with magic, waiting for someone to unlock their secrets. But as they would soon discover, some secrets come with a price that not everyone is willing to pay. As the moon rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees, the group realized that their discovery in the forest was just the beginning. The real challenge would be deciding what to do with the knowledge they had gained, and whether they could trust those who claimed to be their allies. The night was far from over, and the forest had many more secrets to reveal. But one thing was certain: nothing at Hogwarts would ever be the same again. What other mysteries lay hidden in the depths of the Forbidden Forest? And more importantly, were Evelina and her friends ready to face the consequences of uncovering them? The answers would come, but not before testing their courage, loyalty, and understanding of magic itself in ways they never imagined possible. The early morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of the potions classroom as Evelina Hawthorne stood before her cauldron, her brow furrowed in concentration. The events from the Forbidden Forest still weighed heavily on her mind, but something about the peculiar mushrooms they'd discovered kept nagging at her thoughts. Could they be the missing piece to this ever-growing puzzle? "You're here early," came Milo Fenwick's soft voice as he entered the classroom, his Ravenclaw robes slightly dishevelled from his hurried journey. "I got your owl. What's so urgent?" Evelina held up one of the luminescent mushrooms they'd collected. "Remember how Professor Plum said these only grow in places where ancient magic has left its mark? Well, I've been doing some research, and there's something odd about their properties." As she spoke, Sapphire Blakely slipped into the classroom, her presence commanding attention as always. "If you're planning something interesting, Hawthorne, count me in. After what we saw in the forest, I'm not sitting on the sidelines." The three students gathered around Evelina's cauldron as she began to explain her theory. These mushrooms aren't just markers of ancient magic, they're catalysts. When properly prepared, they can reveal traces of old spells, like footprints in the sand. But wouldn't Professor Moonshadow have known about this? Milo questioned, adjusting his glasses nervously. "She's been investigating the disturbances for weeks." Sapphire smirked. "Not if she's been looking in the wrong direction. Sometimes the obvious answer isn't the right one." As Evelina began to brew, carefully adding ingredients to her cauldron, Barnaby Twiddleton burst into the room, nearly tripping over his own feet. "Evelina, I've been looking everywhere for you. Professor Plum is acting strange. Stranger than usual, I mean." The group exchanged worried glances. Professor Plum's eccentric behavior had become increasingly erratic since their forest expedition. But before they could question Barnaby further, a dark figure appeared in the doorway, Malachi Wraithstone. "The mushrooms won't work alone," he said, his voice carrying an edge of knowledge that sent chills down their spines. "You need something else, something that bridges the gap between past and present." Sapphire's hand instinctively moved toward her wand. "And how exactly would you know that, Wraithstone?" Before he could answer, Professor Moonshadow's voice echoed from the corridor. "What are all of you doing here at this hour?" Quick thinking led Evelina to cast a concealment charm on her cauldron, just as the Transfiguration Professor entered. Professor Moonshadow's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the unusual gathering of students. "Professor," Evelina began, her mind racing, We were just practicing for our upcoming potions exam. All of you, from different houses and years. Professor Moonshadow's skepticism was evident, including Mr. Wraithstone, who only arrived at Hogwarts this term. The tension in the room was palpable until Milo spoke up. "It was my idea, Professor. I've been struggling with some concepts, and Evelina offered to help." The others just joined in. Professor Moonshadow's expression remained stern, but something flickered in her eyes. Was it understanding or suspicion? "Very well. But remember, some mysteries are better left unsolved." With that cryptic warning, she left the classroom. Once they were alone again, Sapphire turned to Malachi. "Spill it, Wraithstone. What do you know about the mushrooms?" Malachi moved closer to the cauldron, his dark eyes reflecting the shimmer of the potion. "The disturbances in the castle aren't random. They're echoes of something that happened long ago, something that's trying to repeat itself." "But what's the missing ingredient?" Evelina pressed, her curiosity overwhelming her caution. "You said we need something else." A small smile played at the corners of Malachi's mouth. "Not something, someone. The potion needs the essence of someone who's witnessed both past and present." Suddenly, Barnaby's earlier words about Professor Plum took on new significance. The eccentric herbology professor had always seemed to know more than he let on, speaking in riddles that now seemed less like confusion and more like careful hints. "Professor Plum," Evelina whispered, the realization dawning on her. "He's been trying to tell us all along, hasn't he?" Milo's eyes widened. The way he's been acting lately, what if he's not just being eccentric? What if he's fighting against something? Or someone, Sapphire added darkly, her gaze meeting Malachi's. As the implications of their discovery settled over the group, they knew they were standing on the precipice of something much bigger than they'd initially imagined. The potion wasn't just about revealing old magic. It was about uncovering a truth that someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. But who could they trust? Professor Moonshadow's warning echoed in their minds, and Professor Plum's strange behavior raised more questions than answers. Even Malachi's convenient knowledge seemed suspicious. As Evelina looked at her friends' concerned faces, she knew they had to make a choice: continue down this potentially dangerous path, or heed Professor Moonshadow's warning and let sleeping secrets lie. But something told her that these secrets wouldn't stay dormant for long, whether they chose to pursue them or not. The question now wasn't just about solving a puzzle. It was about being ready for whatever truth they might uncover, and whatever consequences that truth might bring. The great hall buzzed with unusual energy as Professor Moonshadow stood at the podium, her silver robes catching the light from the enchanted ceiling above. The stars seemed to shimmer with particular intensity tonight, and every student could feel something different in the air, a sort of electric anticipation that made their skin tingle. In precisely 3 days, Professor Moonshadow announced, her voice carrying across the silent hall, "Hogwarts will witness the convergence of the 7 stars, a celestial event that occurs once every 3 centuries. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "And this year, it coincides with the ancient magical nexus beneath our very school." Evelina exchanged worried glances with Milo, who was frantically scribbling notes in his ever-present journal. She couldn't help but notice how Sapphire, sitting at the Slytherin table, seemed unusually focused on Malachi Wraithstone's reaction to the news. The new student's face remained impassive, but his knuckles had turned white from gripping the edge of the table. "But what does this alignment mean for us, Professor?" Barnaby called out, nearly knocking over his pumpkin juice in excitement. Professor Moonshadow's expression grew grave. The last time this alignment occurred, Mr. Twiddleton, it caused every magical barrier in Hogwarts to temporarily dissolve, The consequences were significant. After the announcement, Evelina found herself in the library with Milo, surrounded by ancient astronomy texts and star charts. The potion she had successfully brewed in their previous adventure sat in a vial around her neck, glowing with an odd purple light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the stars above. "Look at this, Evelina," Milo whispered, pushing a dusty tome toward her. The convergence doesn't just affect magical barriers, it amplifies all magic within its influence. That's why Professor Plum has been so agitated lately, have you noticed? Indeed, Professor Plum had been acting stranger than usual, spending long hours at the edge of the forbidden forest, muttering to himself and collecting unusual specimens. But before Evelina could respond, Sapphire emerged from between the bookshelves, her face uncharacteristically serious. "We have a problem," she announced, dropping a piece of parchment on their table. "I've been watching Wraithstone, and he's been corresponding with someone outside the castle. Look at what I managed to intercept." The parchment contained a series of complex astronomical calculations and a cryptic message. "When the seven align, the veil will thin. The time approaches to let them in." "Let who in?" Evelina wondered aloud, her hand unconsciously clutching the potion vial. Professor Moonshadow's words from their last Transfiguration class suddenly echoed in her mind. "Magic always seeks balance, Miss Hawthorne. When one door opens, another must close." As if on cue, Barnaby came tumbling into the library, his robes covered in what appeared to be glowing moss. "You won't believe what I just saw in the greenhouse. Professor Plum is building some sort of astronomical device, and it's connected to all these weird plants that only bloom under starlight." The pieces were starting to come together, but they raised more questions than answers. Why was Professor Plum preparing for the alignment? What was Malachi Wraithstone's connection to all of this? And most importantly, what would happen when the seven stars aligned? As the days counted down, strange occurrences began plaguing the castle. Portraits reported seeing shadows moving independently of their casters. Staircases began changing direction more frequently than usual, and even the ghosts seemed more solid than usual. "The potion you brewed," Milo said suddenly, his eyes wide with realization. "Remember what Professor Plum said about it being tied to the ancient magic of Hogwarts? What if it's not just a potion? What if it's a key?" Evelina pulled out the vial, watching as the purple liquid inside swirled with increasing intensity. The stars visible through the library windows seemed to pulse in response, and for a moment she could have sworn she heard whispers in a language she didn't understand, but somehow knew was important. "We need to figure this out before the alignment," Sapphire insisted, her usual competitive nature giving way to genuine concern. "Whatever's coming, it's big enough to have both Wraithstone and Professor Plum preparing for it." As they discussed their next move, none of them noticed Professor Celeste Moonshadow watching from the shadows, her expression a mixture of pride and worry. She knew the students had stumbled upon something far more significant than they realized, something that would require all their combined skills to face. The celestial alignment was approaching, and with it, the potential for both wonderful and terrible magic. The question wasn't just about what would happen when the stars aligned, but whether Evelina and her friends would be ready for what came through when the veil between worlds grew thin. Would the potion prove to be their salvation or their undoing? And more importantly, whose side was Professor Plum really on? As the stars continued their inexorable journey toward alignment, time was running out to find the answers. The ancient library of Hogwarts was unusually quiet that evening, save for the rhythmic tapping of Milo Fenwick's quill against his temple. Scattered around him were dozens of parchments covered in complex numerical sequences and runic symbols. His eyes, red from hours of intense study, darted between an age-worn tome and his own meticulous notes. "It can't be," he whispered to himself, his hands trembling as he traced a particular line of text. "This changes everything we thought we knew." The sound of footsteps approaching made him jump, nearly knocking over his inkwell. Evelina Hawthorne emerged from between the towering bookshelves, her Gryffindor scarf slightly askew. "Milo, you missed dinner again," she said, placing a wrapped sandwich on the table. "What's got you so?" Her voice trailed off as she noticed her friend's pale complexion. "What's wrong?" Milo glanced around nervously before casting a quick muffliato spell to ensure their privacy. "Ev, remember that text Professor Plum mentioned in herbology last week? The one about the ancient connection between magical creatures and the school's founding?" Evelina nodded, pulling up a chair. "The bestiary of Ravenclaw. But that's just a myth, isn't it?" "That's what everyone thought," Milo replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But look at this." He pushed forward a piece of parchment covered in his neat handwriting. "I've been cross-referencing the numerical patterns in Ravenclaw's personal journals with the strange markings we've been seeing around the school." Evelina leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "The ones that appeared after Malachi transferred here?" "Exactly. But here's where it gets interesting and frightening." Milo pulled out another document, this one bearing the official Hogwarts seal. "I found this in the restricted section. It's a letter from Rowena Ravenclaw herself, warning future headmasters about something she called the Creatures' Covenant." Before he could continue, a shadow fell across their table. Sapphire Blakely stood there, her Slytherin tie loosened, and a knowing smirk on her face. "Well, well, what are our two favourite bookworms plotting?" "This doesn't concern you, Sapphire," Evelina said sharply, but Milo raised a hand to stop her. "Actually, we might need her help with this," he said, surprising both girls. "Because if I'm right, this involves all four houses, and Malachi Wraithstone isn't who he claims to be." Just then, young Barnaby Twiddleton came bursting into the library, his Hufflepuff robes dishevelled. "Evelina, Professor Moonshadow sent me to find you. Something's happening in the Forbidden Forest. Professor Plum's gone missing." The four students exchanged worried glances as thunder rumbled outside the castle windows. Milo gathered his papers with shaking hands. "There's more. According to these texts, every 500 years, the magical barriers between our world and the creature realm thin significantly. The last time this happened was when the Chamber of Secrets was created," Sapphire finished, her usual confidence wavering slightly. "But what does this have to do with Professor Plum and Malachi?" Milo's next words sent a chill through the group, because according to Ravenclaw's warning, someone must maintain the balance between the worlds. A keeper of creatures, chosen by the forest itself. I think Professor Plum has been this keeper all along, and now... "Now what?" Barnaby asked, his eyes wide with worry. "Now someone's trying to break the covenant," Milo explained. "And if these calculations are correct, we have until the next full moon to stop them, or both our worlds will collapse into chaos." Evelina stood up, determination etched on her face. "We need to find Professor Moonshadow. But first, Milo, tell us everything you've discovered. What exactly is this covenant, and what does it have to do with the strange behaviour of the magical creatures lately?" As Milo began to explain, none of them noticed the dark figure watching from the shadows between the bookshelves, or the way the mysterious markings on the castle walls seemed to pulse with an eerie light. The revelation was just the beginning. As the storm outside grew stronger, the four students realized they were about to be drawn into something far bigger than themselves. But one question remained. Who could they really trust when ancient magic and modern ambitions collided? Would Professor Plum's mysterious disappearance lead them to the truth about Malach's identity? And what role did Professor Moonshadow play in all of this? As they hurried out of the library, Milo clutched his precious findings close to his chest, knowing that what they discovered next could either save their school or lead to its destruction. The race against time had begun, and the fate of two worlds now rested in the hands of an unlikely group of students who would need to put aside their house rivalries and work together before it was too late. But in the depths of the Forbidden Forest, something ancient was stirring, and the true test of their courage and loyalty was about to begin. The Great Hall's enchanted ceiling reflected a turbulent storm brewing outside Hogwarts, mirroring the tension that had been building since Milo's shocking discovery. Evelina sat at the Gryffindor table, barely touching her shepherd's pie as she watched Sapphire Blakely at the Slytherin table. Something was different about her usually confident classmate. Her shoulders were hunched, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. "Have you noticed anything odd about Sapphire lately?" Evelina whispered to Milo, who had joined her for dinner despite house traditions. Milo looked up from the ancient text he'd decoded, his face pale with worry. "After what I found in these pages, I'm starting to think everything we knew about her was wrong." The decoded text had revealed a prophecy about a guardian chosen to protect Hogwarts from an ancient curse, bound by blood to make the ultimate choice between loyalty and power. As Evelina and Milo discussed their theories, Barnaby Twiddleton stumbled over to their table, his robes covered in what appeared to be purple smoke from another failed spell attempt. "Evelina," he exclaimed, catching his breath. "I just saw something strange in the dungeons." Sapphire was talking to Malachi Wraithstone, and she looked scared. This caught Evelina's attention immediately. Sapphire Blakely didn't get scared, not of anything or anyone. The last time they'd spoken, Sapphire had warned Evelina cryptically about choosing sides when the time comes. Could this be what she meant? Professor Moonshadow swept past their table, her silver robes billowing behind her. She exchanged a meaningful glance with Professor Plum, who was tending to his ever-present pot of mysterious herbs at the staff table. The tension between the two professors had been growing since Milo's discovery, and students had begun to notice. As thunder crashed overhead, Malachi Wraithstone rose from the Slytherin table and left the Great Hall, his dark eyes fixed on something unseen. Moments later, Sapphire followed, her hand clutching her wand so tightly her knuckles were white. "We have to follow them," Evelina declared, standing up. "Something's not right." Milo grabbed her arm. "Wait, the prophecy mentions a confrontation in the shadow of the castle's heart. What if this is it?" They hurried after Sapphire and Malachi, with Barnaby trailing behind them, despite their protests for him to stay behind. The chase led them to the clock tower courtyard, where they found Sapphire facing off against Malachi, her wand raised. "You can't do this, Malachi," Sapphire's voice carried across the courtyard. "I won't let you unleash it." Malachi's laugh was cold and hollow. "You've played your part well, Blakely, the perfect Slytherin, ambitious, cunning, and always looking out for yourself. But we both know what you really are." Rain began to fall as Evelina, Milo, and Barnaby watched from behind a pillar. Lightning illuminated Sapphire's face, revealing tears mixing with the raindrops. "I made a vow to protect this school," Sapphire declared, "just like my mother did before me, and her mother before her." The truth hit Evelina like a bolt of lightning. Sapphire's family had been secret guardians of Hogwarts for generations. Her rule-breaking and seeming self-interest had all been a cover, allowing her to watch and protect from the shadows. Malachi raised his wand, dark energy crackling around him. Then you'll die like your mother did, trying to stop the inevitable. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Malachi cast a curse that illuminated the courtyard with sickly green light. Sapphire could have dodged it, could have saved herself, but she stood her ground and cast a counter spell that created a magical barrier, not around herself, but around the entire clock tower. The collision of spells created an explosion that threw everyone off their feet. When the dust settled, Malachi was gone, but Sapphire lay motionless on the wet stones. Evelina rushed to her side, cradling her head. "Why?" she whispered. "Why didn't you tell us?" Sapphire's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile playing on her lips. "Because that's not how guardians work. We protect from the shadows." She pressed something into Evelina's hand, a small crystal vial containing swirling silver memories. Professor Plum and Professor Moonshadow arrived at the scene, their long-standing rivalry forgotten in the face of crisis. As they worked together to stabilize Sapphire, Evelina looked at the vial in her hand, knowing that it contained answers to questions she hadn't even thought to ask. Milo placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice shaking. The prophecy mentioned a sacrifice that would reveal the true path forward, but it also mentioned a choice that still lies ahead. Barnaby, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. "Is she going to be all right?" As if in answer, Sapphire's eyes opened fully, and she grabbed Evelina's wrist with surprising strength. "The curse. It's not what you think. Trust no one until you've seen my memories. Promise me." The storm raged on above them, but in that moment, everything changed. Sapphire Blakely, the girl they'd all misjudged, had just sacrificed everything to protect them all. But from what? And why did her warning about trust send chills down Evelina's spine? As Professor Moonshadow conjured a stretcher to transport Sapphire to the hospital wing, Evelina clutched the vial of memories tightly. She had a feeling that understanding Sapphire's sacrifice was just the beginning of a much darker mystery, one that would test not just their magic, but their loyalty, courage, and friendship in ways they could never have imagined. What secrets lay within those swirling silver memories? And more importantly, who could they trust when the time came to face whatever darkness Sapphire had given everything to protect them from? The aftermath of Sapphire's shocking revelation left Hogwarts in a state of uneasy silence. The castle corridors, usually buzzing with student chatter, now echoed with whispered conversations and worried glances. Professor Thaddeus Plum stood at his office window, watching the morning mist curl around the Forbidden Forest's ancient trees, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. A sharp knock at his door broke his reverie. "Enter," he called out, already knowing who it would be. Professor Celeste Moonshadow strode in, her emerald robe swishing against the stone floor, her face set in its usual stern expression. "Thaddeus," she said, her voice carrying years of unspoken tension. "I believe we can no longer afford the luxury of our disagreements." Plum turned, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Ah, Celeste, I wondered how long it would take for you to reach the same conclusion I did 3 days ago. Always the Riddler, aren't you?" Moonshadow's voice carried a hint of irritation, but there was something else there too. A grudging respect, perhaps. Their conversation was interrupted by hurried footsteps in the corridor. Evelina Hawthorne burst in, her face flushed with excitement or fear. It was hard to tell which. "Professors, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to know. Malachi Wraithstone, he's..." "Miss Hawthorne," Professor Moonshadow cut in sharply. "This is a private." "Let her speak, Celeste," Plum said softly. "After all, Isn't it our students who often see what we're too proud to notice? Evelina caught her breath and continued. Milo and I followed him to the 7th floor. He was using some kind of dark magic we've never seen before. And Sapphire's sacrifice. I don't think it was what we thought it was. The two professors exchanged meaningful looks. Could it be that they had misinterpreted everything? Had their long-standing rivalry blinded them to a greater danger? Tell me, Celeste, Plum mused, picking up a curious silver instrument from his desk. Do you remember the summer of '82? The incident with the Moonstone manuscript? Moonshadow's usually composed face flickered with recognition. The binding spell, you don't think? I do indeed. Plum turned to Evelina, who was watching this exchange with growing curiosity. Miss Hawthorne, would you be so kind as to fetch Mr. Fenwick and young Mr. Twiddleton? I believe we'll need their particular talents for what's to come. As Evelina hurried off, Plum and Moonshadow began to unravel their complex history. Years ago, they had been more than colleagues. They had been the closest of friends, working together to protect an ancient secret within Hogwarts walls. Their falling out had come from a fundamental disagreement about how to handle this secret, but now it seemed their old quarrel might have inadvertently put everything at risk. The signs were there, Thaddeus, Moonshadow admitted, pacing the office. The unusual magical disturbances in the forest, the strange behavior of the castle's protective enchantments, even young Wraithstone's mysterious transfer. And Sapphire Blakely, Plum added thoughtfully, a student who always seemed to know more than she should. Perhaps her apparent betrayal was something else entirely. Before Moonshadow could respond, Barnaby Twiddleton stumbled into the office, nearly knocking over a shelf of delicate magical instruments. Milo Fenwick followed close behind, his usual shy demeanor replaced by an urgent determination. Professors, Milo said, his voice steady despite his obvious anxiety. I've been having visions. I think I know what's coming. But what was coming? And how would the newfound alliance between these two powerful professors change the course of events? As thunder rolled in the distance and the magical barriers around Hogwarts flickered almost imperceptibly, one question remained. Would their reconciliation come too late to prevent the darkness that was gathering at the edges of their magical world? The story continues to unfold, weaving together the fates of students and teachers alike. What role will each of them play in the coming conflict? And more importantly, what secret have Professors Plum and Moonshadow been protecting all these years? As the rain began to fall outside Plum's office window, the group gathered there couldn't know that their next decisions would set in motion a chain of events that would test not only their magical abilities, but also their trust in one another. The true test was just beginning, and the price of failure would be higher than any of them could imagine. What dark forces were really at work behind Malachi Wraithstone's transfer to Hogwarts? And how did Sapphire's apparent betrayal fit into this complex puzzle? The answers would soon emerge, but they would bring with them even more questions and challenges that would shake the very foundations of Hogwarts itself. The Great Hall buzzed with nervous energy as students huddled together, whispering about the recent alliance between Professor Plum and Professor Moonshadow. Barnaby Twiddleton sat at the Hufflepuff table, his usual cheerful demeanour dampened by the weight of recent events. He watched as Evelina Hawthorne and Milo Fenwick pored over ancient texts, their faces illuminated by floating candles. "Do you think they'll let me help?" Barnaby asked himself quietly, fumbling with his wand and accidentally turning his pumpkin juice into a peculiar purple substance that smelled of old socks. Across the hall, Sapphire Blakely and Malachi Wraithstone were engaged in an intense conversation, their heads close together. Barnaby couldn't help but notice how Mellich's presence seemed to make the shadows around them deeper, more mysterious. What were they planning? And why did it make him feel so uneasy? As the evening progressed, Barnaby found himself wandering the corridors alone, lost in thought. His footsteps echoed against the stone walls, and portraits whispered as he passed. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from Professor Plum's office, urgent, worried voices. "The barriers are weakening," Professor Moonshadow's voice carried through the crack under the door. "If we don't act soon." "But the students," Professor Plum interrupted, "they must be protected at all costs." Barnaby's heart raced. Should he leave? Pretend he hadn't heard anything? But something made him stay, pressing closer to the door. That's when he heard it. A sound that made his blood run cold. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from the very depths of the castle itself. The door burst open, and Barnaby tumbled forward, landing at the feet of his professors. "Mr. Twiddleton," Professor Moonshadow exclaimed, her usual stern expression softening slightly at the sight of the frightened first year. I'm sorry," Barnaby stammered, scrambling to his feet. "I didn't mean to." But Professor Plum was already helping him up, a curious gleam in his eye. "Perhaps," he mused, "this is exactly where young Mr. Twiddleton needs to be." What followed was a night that would change Barnaby's life forever. As the ancient threat beneath Hogwarts grew stronger, it was Barnaby's understanding of loyalty and friendship, core Hufflepuff values, that would prove invaluable. While Evelina and Milo worked on complex spells, and Sapphire and Malachi pursued their own mysterious agenda, Barnaby discovered that sometimes the simplest magic could be the most powerful. His ability to care deeply, to notice the small details others missed, and his unwavering determination to help his friends would turn out to be exactly what they needed. But what was the true nature of the threat lurking beneath the castle? And why did Professor Plum seem to think that Barnaby's presence was more than just a coincidence? As the night unfolded, these questions would lead to answers that no one expected, least of all the clumsy first year who had always doubted his own abilities. The castle trembled again, and this time everyone felt it. Students gathered in the common rooms, fear evident on their faces. But Barnaby stood tall, his wand held steady for the first time since he'd arrived at Hogwarts. He might not have been the most skilled wizard, but he knew one thing for certain. He would do whatever it took to protect his friends and his school. As Professor Moonshadow gathered the students for an emergency meeting, Barnaby caught Evelina's eye across the room. She gave him an encouraging nod, and for the first time, he felt truly worthy of being at Hogwarts. But what role would he play in the events to come? And would his newfound courage be enough to face the darkness that threatened to engulf them all? The night was far from over, and as the castle's ancient magic pulsed around them, Barnaby Twiddleton prepared to prove that being a Hufflepuff meant more than just being kind and hardworking. Sometimes it meant being brave enough to stand up when others couldn't, and wise enough to see solutions where others saw only problems. The question wasn't whether Barnaby would rise to the challenge, it was whether the challenge was ready for Barnaby Twiddleton, the unexpected hero of Hogwarts. As the clock struck midnight, the castle's foundations shook once more, and Barnaby gripped his wand tighter. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. Not alone, but with the strength of his house and the support of his friends behind him. After all, isn't that what true bravery is all about? The evening shadows stretched across Hogwarts corridors like reaching fingers, and an unusual stillness had settled over the castle. Evelina Hawthorne couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The events of the previous day, where young Barnaby had shown extraordinary courage in helping them escape from a particularly nasty encounter with enchanted armor suits had left her with more questions than answers. "Have you noticed how Malach's been acting lately?" Milo whispered to Evelina as they huddled in the library, surrounded by towering shelves of ancient books. "He wasn't at breakfast this morning, or any classes for that matter." Evelina nodded, her fingers absently tracing the worn leather binding of Darkness Unveiled, a history of forbidden magic. "Something's definitely changed since the incident with Barnaby. Did you see his face when the armor suits stopped attacking? It was almost like he was disappointed." But what could Malachi Wraithstone possibly want? And why had he chosen Hogwarts? These questions had been haunting Evelina for weeks now. Suddenly, Sapphire Blakely emerged from between the bookshelves, her usual confident demeanour replaced by obvious concern. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice uncharacteristically serious. "Both of you." Leading them to a secluded corner of the library, Sapphire pulled out a piece of parchment from her robes. "I found this in Malach's notebook when he dropped it in the common room." The parchment contained intricate drawings of what appeared to be ancient runes, along with calculations and notes written in a hurried hand. "These aren't just any runes," Milo explained, his eyes widening as he studied the markings. "They're binding runes, the kind used in some of the darkest magic imaginable. But what's he trying to bind?" Their answer came sooner than expected. A thunderous crash echoed through the castle, followed by screams from the direction of the Great Hall. The three friends exchanged glances before rushing toward the commotion. The scene that greeted them was chaos incarnate. Students were running in all directions as dark shadows writhed along the walls. In the center of it all stood Malachi Wraithstone, his wand raised high, dark energy crackling around him like lightning. Finally, his voice boomed, unnaturally deep and resonant. "After centuries of waiting, the seal will be broken." Professor Moonshadow and Professor Plum stood at opposite ends of the hall, their wands at the ready. "Mr. Wraithstone," Professor Moonshadow called out, her voice steady despite the situation. "Whatever you're attempting to do, it's not too late to stop." But Malach's laugh sent chills down everyone's spine. "You don't understand, Professor. It's been too late for centuries. The Wraithstone family has waited generations for this moment, when the stars align perfectly with the castle's own magical ley lines. Hogwarts itself will become the catalyst for awakening what was meant to stay dormant." Evelina's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place. Malachi's mysterious appearances in restricted areas, his keen interest in the castle's history, his questions about magical convergence points. But what was he trying to awaken? Professor Plum stepped forward, his usually dreamy expression replaced by grim determination. "The sleeping guardian," he said softly, but his words carried across the hall. "That's what you're after, isn't it?" Malachi's eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. "The most powerful magical entity ever bound within these walls. Once released, its power will be mine to command." "We can't let that happen," Sapphire declared, raising her wand. "The Guardian was bound for a reason." But before anyone could act, Barnaby Twiddleton, of all people, stumbled into the hall. "Evelina, I figured it out," he called excitedly, completely oblivious to the danger. "Remember that book about magical bindings you helped me with last week? The one about how love and sacrifice can break any dark magic." Time seemed to freeze as Evelina's eyes met Milo's. Of course, the answer had been right in front of them all along. Dark magic required darkness to thrive, but what if? "Everyone," Evelina shouted, her voice carrying across the chaos. "Think of your happiest memory at Hogwarts. The moments of friendship, of triumph, of joy. Understanding dawned on Professor Moonshadow's face. The castle's magic responds to its inhabitants' emotions, she called out. Focus on the light. One by one, students and teachers alike raised their wands, each calling forth their brightest memories. The dark energy surrounding Malachi began to flicker and fade as waves of positive magic filled the hall. No! Malachi screamed, but his voice was growing weaker. You don't understand what you're preventing. The power, the glory. The only thing we're preventing, Evelina said firmly, is another dark wizard's attempt to control what should remain free. As the combined force of hundreds of happy memories reached its peak, the darkness surrounding Malachi imploded with a deafening crack. The young wizard collapsed to his knees, his grand plans literally dissolving into nothing more than shadows and whispers. In the aftermath, as Professor Moonshadow and other teachers secured Malachi and began the process of strengthening the castle's protective enchantments, Evelina couldn't help but wonder, how many other secrets did Hogwarts hold? And more importantly, how many other would-be dark wizards might be waiting in the shadows, ready to unlock them? But for now, as she watched Barnaby proudly explaining his accidental role in saving the day to anyone who would listen, she allowed herself to smile. Sometimes the greatest magic came not from ancient spells or dark rituals, but from the simple power of unity and friendship. What other challenges awaited them in the corridors of Hogwarts? Only time would tell, but at least they would face them together. The revelation of Malachi Wraithstone's true intentions had left the halls of Hogwarts buzzing with tension. Evelina Hawthorne found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with questions about the strange occurrences that had plagued the castle throughout the year. The magical disturbances had grown stronger, and now even the portraits were whispering about an ancient power stirring within the castle's walls. There has to be a connection, Evelina muttered to herself, pacing the Gryffindor common room in the early hours of the morning. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Why would Malachi choose this particular time to reveal himself? A gentle knock on the common room window startled her. There, perched on the ledge, was Milo Fenwick's owl carrying a hastily scribbled note. Meet me in the library immediately. I found something in the restricted section. M. Without hesitation, Evelina slipped on her robes and made her way through the silent corridors. The castle seemed different at night, almost alive with an energy she had never noticed before. Was it her imagination, or were the stones themselves pulsing with a faint, bluish light? In the library, she found Milo surrounded by ancient tomes, his usually neat hair dishevelled from hours of research. Look at this, he whispered excitedly, pointing to a weathered page. The founders didn't just build Hogwarts. They created a magical core, a heart, to power the castle's defences and sustain its enchantments. A heart. Evelina leaned closer, her eyes scanning the faded text. But what does this have to do with the disturbances? Everything, came a voice from the shadows. Sapphire Blakely emerged, her face uncharacteristically serious. I've been tracking Malachi's movements. He's not just after power. He's trying to locate the castle's heart. The three students shared a knowing look. If Malachi gained control of Hogwarts' magical core, the consequences would be catastrophic. But where was this heart hidden? And how had it remained secret for so long? Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Professor Plum, who seemed unsurprised to find them there. Ah, I see you've discovered what's at stake, he said, his eyes twinkling with a mixture of pride and concern. But there's more to this story than what's written in those books. He proceeded to tell them about an ancient prophecy, one that spoke of a time when the castle's heart would become vulnerable to darkness. The signs have been there all along, he explained. The fluctuating magic, the strange behaviors of the magical creatures in the Forbidden Forest, even the way the staircases have been moving more erratically than usual. Professor Moonshadow joined them, her usual stern expression replaced by one of urgency. We've been monitoring the situation closely, she admitted, but we never expected one of our own students to be the threat we were watching for. Meanwhile, young Barnaby Twiddleton, who had been practicing late-night spells in an empty classroom, stumbled upon something extraordinary. The clumsy first year had accidentally discovered a hidden chamber while trying to recover his runaway wand. His excited shouts echoed through the corridors, drawing the attention of both the conspirators and those trying to protect the castle. As the group converged on Barnaby's location, they found themselves facing an ancient door, covered in runes that seemed to shift and change before their eyes. The entrance to the heart chamber. Professor Plum breathed, his voice filled with awe. It reveals itself only in times of greatest need. But they weren't alone in their discovery. Malachi Wraithstone stepped out from behind a cobham, his wand raised. "I must thank you all," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "I've spent months searching for this entrance, and now you've led me right to it." The air crackled with tension as students and professors alike raised their wands. The castle itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would they be able to protect the magical core that had sustained Hogwarts for centuries? Or would Malachi's dark ambitions finally come to fruition? As they stood there, facing each other in the flickering torchlight, Evelina couldn't help but wonder. What secrets lay behind that ancient door? And more importantly, what price would they have to pay to keep those secrets safe? The answer to these questions would change everything they thought they knew about Hogwarts, magic, and themselves. But first, they would have to survive the night and prevent the castle's heart from falling into the wrong hands. What none of them realized was that the heart of Hogwarts had already chosen its champion, and the next few moments would reveal just how deep the castle's magic truly ran. The only question was, would they recognize the signs before it was too late? The Great Hall's enchanted ceiling swirled with ominous dark clouds as Evelina Hawthorne stood before her fellow students, her heart pounding against her chest. The revelation from the previous night still echoed in her mind. Hogwarts' very magical core was destabilizing, and she held the key to its salvation. But at what cost? "There has to be another way," Myo Fenwick whispered, his usually calm voice trembling. He clutched a worn, leather-bound book, its pages filled with their desperate research from the past weeks. The arithmetic calculations suggest. "We don't have time for more calculations," Sapphire Blakely cut in, her usual confidence tinged with genuine concern. "The castle's wards are failing. Did you see what happened in the dungeons this morning?" Indeed, they all had. The ancient stones had begun to crack, releasing spurts of wild magic that transformed everything they touched. Professor Moonshadow's classroom now housed a family of peacocks that had once been her prized collection of wooden chairs. Professor Plum approached their huddled group, his normally whimsical expression replaced by grave seriousness. "Miss Hawthorne," he said softly, "I fear we must act soon. The choice must be yours, but know that whatever you decide, you won't face it alone." Evelina's hand instinctively went to the crystal vial in her robe pocket, the potion she'd created through weeks of careful experimentation. It was meant to stabilize the castle's heart, but the price was steep. Whoever administered it would have to bind their own magical core to Hogwarts for an entire year. "But what about your studies?" Barnaby Twiddleton piped up, his young face creased with worry. "You won't be able to do any magic at all." Malachi Wraithstone, who had been silently observing from the shadows, finally spoke. "There's dark magic at work here," he said, his voice carrying an edge of knowledge that made everyone uneasy. The castle's heart didn't simply decide to fail on its own. "What do you know about it, Wraithstone?" Sapphire challenged, her wand hand twitching slightly. Before Malachi could respond, Professor Moonshadow swept into the hall, her robes billowing behind her. "The ministry representatives will be here within the hour," she announced. "If we cannot demonstrate that we have the situation under control, they will evacuate the school immediately." Evelina felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. She knew what evacuation meant. Hogwarts would be sealed, perhaps permanently. Generations of magical education and tradition would end, all because the castle's ancient magic was unraveling. "But why me?" Evelina asked, voicing the question that had haunted her since they discovered the solution. "Why does it have to be my magic?" Professor Plum's eyes twinkled with a hint of their usual mischief. "Sometimes, Miss Hawthorne, magic chooses us rather than the other way around. Your connection to the castle's heart is unique, perhaps because you've always seen Hogwarts not just as a school, but as a living entity." Memories flooded Evelina's mind. Her first year exploring the secret passages, the countless hours in the potions laboratory, the way the castle seemed to guide her when she was lost. Hogwarts had become more than a school, it was home. "If you do this," Milo said, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder, "we'll help you through the year. All your studies, all your notes. We'll make sure you don't fall behind. I'll even share my defense against the dark arts notes," Sapphire added with a slight smirk, "though I doubt you'll be able to read my handwriting." A distant rumble shook the castle walls, and several students screamed as a shower of sparks rained down from the enchanted ceiling. The magic was becoming more unstable by the minute. "There's something else you should know." Malachi stepped forward, his dark eyes intense. "The binding, it might not only take your magic for a year. There's a chance, a small one, that the connection could become permanent." The great hall fell silent. Even the portraits on the walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for Evelina's response. What would you do, faced with such a choice? Would you sacrifice your own magical abilities to save the school that had become your home? As Evelina looked around at the faces of her friends, her teachers, and her fellow students, she knew that her decision would affect not just her future, but the future of magical education itself. The crystal vial felt heavy in her pocket, its contents shimmering with an otherworldly glow. Time was running out, and the ministry representatives were on their way. Would she take the risk and bind herself to Hogwarts, potentially losing her magic forever? Or would she step aside and watch as the greatest school of witchcraft and wizardry crumbled into magical chaos? The answer, as it turned out, had been within her heart all along, just as the castle's heart had chosen her. But what consequences would her choice bring? And what dark force had caused this crisis in the first place? As Evelina reached for the vial, the castle trembled once more, as if acknowledging the weight of the moment. The time for decision had come, and with it, the future of Hogwarts hung in the balance. The great hall's enchanted ceiling reflected the turbulent storm brewing outside Hogwarts, matching the tension that filled the air. Evelina Hawthorne stood at its centre, her wand trembling slightly in her hand as she faced the impossible choice she had just made. The ancient tome Professor Plum had given her lay open at her feet, its pages glowing with an otherworldly light. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Miss Hawthorne?" Professor Moonshadow's usually stern voice carried a note of genuine concern. "The ancestral binding spell hasn't been attempted in over 3 centuries, and for good reason." Milo Fenwick stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "There has to be another way, Evelina. The risks, He trailed off, unable to finish the thought that everyone present shared. The spell could either save them all or destroy the caster. "We're running out of time," Sapphire Blakely interjected, her usual confidence tempered by the gravity of the situation. "The protective wards are failing, and Notch is warning about what's coming." She glanced toward the windows, where dark shapes could be seen moving in the distance. The mention of Malachite Wraithstone brought a fresh wave of murmurs through the gathered students and faculty. His revelation about the ancient curse threatening Hogwarts had changed everything, but his subsequent disappearance had left them with more questions than answers. Professor Plum moved closer to Evelina, his normally whimsical demeanor replaced by something more somber. "The magic you're about to attempt, my dear, it's not just about power, it's about understanding. Remember what we discussed about the balance between light and shadow?" Evelina nodded, recalling their conversations in the greenhouse. "Like the moonflower that blooms in darkness, but carries the light within," she quoted, drawing a small smile from her mentor. Barnaby Twiddleton, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up from where he stood with the other first years. "But what if it goes wrong? What if we lose you?" His voice cracked with emotion, reminding everyone that despite her young age, Evelina had become a pillar of strength for many at Hogwarts. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. What indeed would happen if the spell failed? Would the price of failure be too high? But then again, what choice did they have? The spell requires a focal point. Professor Moonshadow explained, her eyes meeting Evelina's. Something that connects the caster to both the school and its inhabitants. Something powerful enough to channel such ancient magic. Sapphire stepped forward, reaching into her robes. Perhaps this might help. She produced a crystal vial containing what appeared to be liquid starlight, the rare essence of a celestial event they had captured together during their midnight adventure in the astronomy tower. Milo's eyes widened in recognition. The stellar convergence extract. But that was meant for something important, Sapphire finished. "I'd say saving our school qualifies." As thunder rolled overhead, Evelina took a deep breath and began the intricate wand work required for the spell's preparation. The ancient words felt heavy on her tongue, each syllable carrying the weight of centuries of magical history. But even as she started the incantation, questions raced through her mind. Why had Malachite chosen to reveal the curse's existence only to vanish? What did Professor Plum know about the spell that he wasn't sharing? And most importantly, would her strength be enough to protect those she had grown to love? The air around her began to crackle with magical energy, and the floating candles flickered ominously. Professor Moonshadow raised her own wand, ready to intervene if necessary, while Professor Plum watched with an unreadable expression. "Remember," he said softly, "magic always comes with a price. The question is not whether you can pay it, but whether you understand what you're buying." As Evelina continued the complex spell, the very foundations of Hogwarts seemed to respond. The stone walls hummed with ancient power, and portraits of past headmasters leaned forward in their frames, watching with intense interest. What none of them noticed was the shadow that briefly passed across the enchanted ceiling, a shape too deliberate to be mere storm clouds. Nor did they see the figure watching from the highest tower, their cloak billowing in the wind, holding what appeared to be the missing half of the ancient tome from which Evelina now read. The spell reached its crescendo, and as Evelina spoke the final words, a brilliant light erupted from her wand, enveloping the great hall. In that moment of blinding radiance, would their gamble pay off? Would the forbidden spell be their salvation or their doom? The answer lay in the seconds that followed, as the light began to fade, and the true consequences of their desperate choice would finally be revealed. But one thing was certain: nothing at Hogwarts would ever be the same again. The Great Hall buzzed with an unusual tension as students from all 4 houses gathered, their usual segregated seating abandoned in the face of necessity. Evelina Hawthorne stood at the Gryffindor table, her eyes scanning the mixed crowd of students wearing green, blue, yellow, and red ties. The events of the previous day, when they had discovered the ancient spell's true nature, still weighed heavily on everyone's minds. "We can't afford to be divided anymore," Evelina announced, her voice carrying across the hall. "What we're facing is bigger than house rivalries." She caught Sapphire Blakely's eye from across the room, remembering their years of competition and recent reconciliation. Milo Fenwick, clutching his worm divination journal, stepped forward. "According to my latest readings, the magical barriers around Hogwarts are weakening at an alarming rate. We need to combine our strengths, not just our spells." Professor Thaddeus Plum, who had been quietly observing from the staff table, rose to his feet. "As the old saying goes, a wand bundle cannot be broken, but single twigs snap with ease. Perhaps now is the time to demonstrate the truth in those words." His eyes twinkled mysteriously as he glanced at Professor Celeste Moonshadow. Professor Moonshadow, despite her usual stern demeanour, nodded in agreement. The founders built Hogwarts on the principle of unity through diversity. Each house brings unique qualities that, when combined, create something far more powerful than the sum of its parts. Young Barnaby Twiddleton, who had been fidgeting nervously at the Hufflepuff table, suddenly spoke up. "But how can we work together when we've spent so long competing?" His question voiced the doubt many students felt. Sapphire Blakely stood up, her Slytherin robes swishing dramatically. "Simple. We stop seeing each other as rivals and start seeing each other as allies. Slytherin's cunning combined with Ravenclaw's wisdom, Hufflepuff's loyalty, and Gryffindor's courage. Imagine what we could achieve." The mention of house traits drew attention to Malachi Wraithstone, who had been lurking in the shadows. His dark eyes met Evelina's, and for once they shared an understanding. "The ancient magic we discovered," he said, his voice low but clear. "It requires more than just power. It requires balance." As the students began to mingle, breaking centuries-old seating traditions, Evelina found herself at the centre of an unlikely group. Milo sat to her right, already sketching out theoretical magical combinations in his notebook. Sapphire lounged across from them, her usual smirk replaced by a look of determination. Even Barnaby had joined them, his presence adding a touch of innocent enthusiasm to their serious discussion. "But what about the risks?" Someone called out from the crowd. "The last time we tried to use ancient magic." Evelina stood again, her voice stronger this time. "Yes, there are risks. But isn't that exactly why we need to stand together? Each house has its strengths, its secrets, its magic. Apart, we're vulnerable. Together." She paused, looking around at the faces turned toward her. "Together, we might just be invincible." Professor Plum approached their table, Professor Moonshadow at his side. "The founders left us more than just a school," he mused, running his fingers along the ancient wooden table. "They left us a legacy of unity. Perhaps it's time we honoured that legacy." As the evening progressed, something remarkable began to happen. Study groups formed across house lines, with Ravenclaws sharing their research methods, Hufflepuffs organising support networks, Slytherins teaching advanced defensive spells, and Gryffindors leading practical training sessions. Malachi, who had been observing the proceedings with his usual intensity, finally spoke again. "The darkness coming for Hogwarts, it feeds on division, on fear, on mistrust. By standing together, we're already fighting back. The night grew late, but no one seemed eager to leave. In every corner of the Great Hall, students who had once been rivals were now sharing knowledge, teaching each other spells, and forming bonds that transcended their house colours. As Evelina watched this transformation, she couldn't help but wonder, was this what the founders had envisioned all along? Had it taken a threat to their very existence to remind them of the strength they could find in unity? Professor Moonshadow's voice cut through her thoughts. Remember, Miss Hawthorne, the greatest magic often comes not from the spells we cast, but from the bonds we forge. The question now wasn't whether they could work together, but whether they could do it in time. As the magical barriers continued to weaken, and the ancient spell's power grew more crucial by the hour, would this newfound unity be enough to save their beloved school? Looking around at the intermingled houses, at the determination on every face, at the magic sparking between newly formed alliances, Evelina felt something she hadn't experienced in days: hope. But as night fell over Hogwarts, one question remained. What price would they have to pay to protect everything they held dear? The Great Hall's enchanted ceiling reflected the tumultuous storm brewing outside Hogwarts, its dark clouds swirling ominously as students from all 4 houses gathered together. Evelina Hawthorne stood at the forefront, her wand gripped tightly in her trembling hand. Beside her, Milo Fenwick's usually timid demeanour had been replaced by quiet determination, while Sapphire Blakely's characteristic smirk had given way to a serious expression that few had ever witnessed. "Do you really think we're ready for this?" Barnaby Twiddleton whispered, his voice quavering, but his young face set with resolve. The first-year Hufflepuff had grown so much since his early days of magical mishaps, and Evelina felt a surge of pride as she looked at him. "Together, we're stronger than any dark force," she assured him, though her own heart raced with anticipation. The unity they had achieved in the previous weeks would now be put to its ultimate test. Professor Thaddeus Plum emerged from the shadows, his usually whimsical demeanour replaced by grave seriousness. "The ancient magic of Hogwarts flows through each of you," he declared, his eyes meeting each student's gaze. "But remember, it's not just about power, it's about understanding." Malachi Wraithstone stood slightly apart from the group, his dark eyes fixed on the entrance to the Great Hall. The secret he had carried for so long had finally come to light, but would it be enough to save them? Could the very knowledge that had once threatened to tear the school apart now be the key to its salvation? Professor Celeste Moonshadow strode forward, her usually pristine robes bearing the marks of recent magical combat. "The wards are weakening," she announced, exchanging a meaningful look with Professor Plum. "Whatever's coming, it's stronger than anything we faced before." The air crackled with tension as Evelina recalled the events that had led them here. The mysterious disappearances, the ancient prophecy hidden in the library's restricted section, and the shocking revelation about Hogwarts' forgotten history. It all seemed to converge on this moment. "We need to combine our strengths," Sapphire declared, stepping forward. "Ravenclaw's wisdom, Hufflepuff's loyalty, Slytherin's cunning, and Gryffindor's courage, just as the founders intended." She glanced at Malachi, adding, "And sometimes the darkest magic can light the way to salvation." Milo pulled out the enchanted map they had discovered in their earlier adventures. "The magical signatures are strongest near the astronomy tower," he reported, his voice steady despite his fear. "Whatever's trying to breach the castle's defences, that's where it'll strike first." As if in response to his words, a deep rumbling shook the castle's foundations. The younger students huddled closer together, while the older ones formed a protective circle around them. Evelina felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, How many lives depended on their success tonight? Remember what we learned about magical resonance? Professor Plum called out, his voice carrying across the hall. When different types of magic harmonize, they create something greater than the sum of their parts. Evelina's mind raced back to their discoveries in the Forbidden Forest, the ancient texts they had decoded, and the countless hours spent practicing defensive spells. But would it be enough? Could they really stand against a force that had been gathering strength for centuries? The castle trembled again, and this time, the enchanted ceiling showed flashes of sickly green light breaking through the storm clouds. Barnaby clutched his wand tighter, looking to Evelina for reassurance. She squeezed his shoulder, remembering how far they'd all come since the beginning of the year. "We need to move now," Professor Moonshadow commanded, her wand already tracking the magical disturbances. "Remember your training, trust in each other, and above all, protect Hogwarts." As they moved into position, Evelina caught Sapphire's eye. Their past rivalries seemed trivial now, replaced by a mutual understanding and respect forged in the face of danger. "Ready to make history, Hawthorne?" Sapphire asked, a ghost of her old smirk returning. "Ready as I'll ever be," Evelina replied, raising her wand. The question wasn't whether they would fight. It was whether their newfound unity would be strong enough to overcome the ancient darkness that threatened their school. The castle's very stones seemed to pulse with magical energy as students and teachers alike prepared for battle. Would their combined strength be enough to protect everything they held dear? As another tremor shook the castle, Evelina realized they were about to find out. The time for preparation was over. The final battle for Hogwarts' future was about to begin, and every spell, every secret, and every bond of friendship they had forged would be tested in the crucible of conflict. As thunder rolled overhead, Evelina took a deep breath and stepped forward to meet their destiny. What force awaited them in the astronomy tower? How would their united magic stand against an enemy that had waited centuries to strike? The answers would come soon enough, but one thing was certain: win or lose, Hogwarts would never be the same after this night. The Great Hall fell silent as Malachi Wraithstone stood before the assembled students and faculty, his usually confident demeanor replaced by an unmistakable vulnerability. The events of the past few weeks had led to this moment, and the weight of his decisions hung heavy in the air. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Malachi began, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying across the hushed hall. Evelina Hawthorne watched from the Gryffindor table, her heart racing as she remembered the series of events that had brought them here. Sapphire Blakely, seated at the Slytherin table, couldn't help but lean forward, her usual smirk replaced by genuine concern. She'd have been the first to notice something different about Malachi, hadn't she? Those late-night conversations in the common room, where he had almost revealed his secret, now made perfect sense. "My family's legacy," Malachi continued, "has always been tied to the darker aspects of magic. The Wraithstones were known for their mastery over shadow magic, but what few knew was the price we pay for that power." His words sent a shiver through the assembled crowd. Professor Celeste Moonshadow exchanged knowing glances with Professor Thaddeus Plum. They had suspected something was amiss when the ancient wards of Hogwarts began to flicker and fade. But who could have guessed that it was all connected to a student trying to break free from his family's curse? Milo Fenwick, clutching his divination journal, remembered the cryptic visions he'd been having all term. "The shadow that seeks the light," he had written repeatedly, never understanding its meaning until now. He caught Evelina's eye across the hall, and they shared a moment of understanding. "The ritual I performed in the Forbidden Forest," Malachi explained, his voice growing stronger, "wasn't meant to harm anyone. I was trying to sever the connection between my bloodline and the shadow magic that has corrupted my family for generations. Tears glistened in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Little Barnaby Twiddleton, who had accidentally stumbled upon Malachay's secret ritual, stood up from the Hufflepuff table. "I saw it," he exclaimed, his usual clumsiness forgotten in the gravity of the moment. The shadows weren't attacking. They were trying to break free. Professor Plum stepped forward, his weathered face bearing a gentle smile. "Sometimes, young Wraithstone, the darkest paths can lead us to the brightest revelations. But why didn't you come to us for help?" The question hung in the air, and everyone could see Malachy struggling with the answer. How could he explain the generations of secrecy, the whispered warnings, and the fear that had been instilled in him since childhood? Sapphire rose from her seat, her voice clear and determined. "Because some burdens feel too heavy to share." She walked to stand beside Malachy, surprising everyone with this display of solidarity. "But that's exactly why we're here at Hogwarts, to learn that we don't have to face our challenges alone." Evelina joined them next, followed by Milo. The four students, once divided by house rivalries and secrets, now stood united. Professor Moonshadow watched with barely concealed pride as other students began to rise, offering their support. "The shadow magic," Malachy revealed, "it's been killing my family slowly, generation after generation. I thought I could end it myself, protect everyone by keeping it secret. But I was wrong." He turned to face Professor Moonshadow directly. "I need help." The stern Transfiguration Professor's expression softened. "Mr. Wraithstone, your courage in admitting this truth shows more strength than any dark magic could ever provide. We will help you break this curse, but we'll do it the right way, together." As the hall erupted in supportive murmurs, Evelina couldn't help but wonder, how many other students carried similar burdens? How many ancient magical families harbored dangerous secrets? And most importantly, would this moment of unity last beyond the immediate crisis? The answers to these questions would have to wait, as Professor Plum announced the formation of a special research group to help Malachy. "Sometimes," he mused, speaking in his characteristic riddles, "the shadows we run from are merely the light we haven't learned to embrace yet." As the assembly dispersed, Malachy found himself surrounded by his newfound allies. Sapphire punched his arm playfully. Milo already had his nose buried in a book about family curses, and Evelina was planning which potions might help. Even Barnaby hovered nearby, eager to help in any way he could. For the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Malachy Wraithstone felt truly seen, not as a dark legacy or a potential threat, but as a student seeking redemption. And perhaps that was the greatest magic of all. But as night fell over Hogwarts, and the stars began to twinkle in the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall, one question remained. What other secrets lay hidden within the ancient walls of Hogwarts, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to face them?